The television flickers in Simon Petrikov's apartment, and the news anchor's voice cracks just slightly when she says the word evacuate. Outside his window, the sky's turning a colour that doesn't have a name yet, something between green and the end of everything. Simon's hands shake as he holds the ice crown, that cursed artefact he bought from a dockworker in Scandinavia, and he knows with the terrible clarity of someone watching their world end that he's about to make a choice he'll regret for 1,000 years. The crown whispers promises he doesn't want to hear: safety, power, survival. He can already feel it changing him, even now, after just a few times wearing it. Yesterday he forgot his colleague's name mid-conversation. Last week he caught himself referring to Betty in the past tense, even though she's only been gone 6 months, lost somewhere in the jungle searching for him, for answers, for a way to break the curse he's too stubborn to admit he's under. The television screen whites out. Then the first mushroom cloud blooms on the horizon like a flower designed by death itself. In this video, we're diving deep into the Great Mushroom War, the apocalyptic event that transformed Earth into the Land of Ooo. We're talking nuclear fallout, magic mutations, ice wizards losing their minds, and how a single catastrophic war created everything we love about Adventure Time. So get cozy, like, subscribe, and let's start. Because what happened next wasn't just the end of the world, it was the beginning of something so strange, so beautiful, and so fundamentally broken that even 1,000 years later, the Land of Ooo still bears the scars like candy-coated wounds. The moment everything changed. Simon Petrikov was an antiquarian, a collector of obscure artifacts, a researcher of forgotten mysteries, a man who believed that understanding the past could illuminate the future. The irony would be poetic if it wasn't so devastating. He spent his career studying ancient magic, translating texts that warned about cursed objects and the price of power, and then he went and bought a crown from a sketchy dockworker because it looked interesting. The crown looked like something a mountain king might wear in a Norse saga. Glacial blue crystals, ancient metals, and an aura that made the air around it taste like winter. Simon was fascinated by it professionally and personally. Betty thought he was obsessed. She was right, of course, but obsession feels different from the inside. It feels like passion, like purpose, like finally finding the thing you were meant to study. The first time he put it on, just to see what would happen, his apartment froze solid. Ice crept across the walls in fractal patterns. His breath turned to visible mist, and for one terrible moment he felt something else inside his mind. Something old. Something that found his thoughts amusing, in the way you might find a child's drawing amusing, endearing but ultimately disposable. He took the crown off. The ice remained for hours. Betty left for an expedition 3 months later. She said it was about her career, about finally leading her own research team instead of playing assistant to Simon's increasingly erratic studies. But they both knew it was also about the crown, about the way he kept returning to it, about the cold that now seemed to follow him even when the artifact was locked in his safe. And now Betty was gone, missing somewhere in Southeast Asia, her last communication a static-filled satellite call saying she'd found something important. And Simon was alone in his apartment watching the world end on every channel simultaneously. The television switches between feeds, New York consumed by fire, Moscow disappearing under clouds that rained something worse than ash, Beijing's skyline crumbling like a sandcastle, hit by waves, London, Paris, Cairo, Tokyo. The names blur together because geography doesn't matter anymore when everywhere is burning. Simon's phone rings 14 times in rapid succession. Friends, colleagues, his brother calling from Seattle. He doesn't answer any of them. What would he say? That he's holding a magic crown that might protect him. That he's considering putting it on again even though he knows it's eating his mind. That he's sorry they're all about to die, but at least the antiquarian community will finally take his research on pre-Christian magical artifacts seriously. The absurdity almost makes him laugh. Outside, sirens compete with screams compete with the deep rumbling sound that means another warhead has found its target. Simon's apartment is in Boston, far enough from obvious targets that he might have hours instead of minutes, or maybe seconds. The war isn't following logical patterns anymore, if it ever did. He opens his safe and removes the crown. It's cold to the touch, always cold, like holding a piece of winter itself. The crystals catch the light from his desk lamp, one of the few sources of illumination left since the power grid started failing, and throw blue shadows across his walls like frozen ghosts. Simon thinks about Betty, about their first date at the museum, how she challenged his interpretation of Viking runestones and turned out to be completely correct, about their argument 3 months ago, the one where she said he was choosing the crown over her, and he denied it even though they both knew the truth, about how he wrote her a letter explaining everything, a letter she'll never read because the postal service has probably ceased to exist, and also because he's fairly certain she's dead in whatever jungle swallowed her expedition whole. Another explosion closer this time, his windows rattle. Coffee mug on the desk topples, spilling cold liquid across his notes about the crown's origins. The research doesn't matter now. Nothing matters except the basic mathematics of survival. The crown whispers again, louder this time, clearer. Simon puts it on. The world through ice-tinted vision. The transformation isn't instant. That's what makes it cruel. Simon feels the power flood through him like frozen electricity, feels his body temperature drop, feels reality bend around him in ways that would fascinate him if he was still capable of academic fascination, instead of this terrible crystalline clarity. He walks to his window and watches another mushroom cloud bloom in the distance. The blast wave will reach him eventually, but not yet. Not if the crown's magic holds. Not if he's willing to pay the price. The price is always too high. Every fairy tale, every myth, every cautionary legend says the same thing. Magic costs. Power corrupts. Wishes come with clauses written in fine print that only becomes visible after you've signed away everything you loved. Simon knows this. He's written papers about it. He's lectured about it. And he's putting on the crown anyway because what else is there? Die instantly in nuclear fire, or live long enough to forget why dying might have been preferable. The streets below are chaos incarnate, people running without destinations because there's nowhere safe to run, cars abandoned mid-intersection, buildings collapsing not from bombs, but from fundamental infrastructure failure as society stops pretending it can function. Simon watches it all through his window with the crown's influence already turning his thoughts strange and recursive. He thinks about thermodynamics, about how energy can't be created or destroyed, only transformed. The bombs below are transforming matter into light and heat and death. The crown is transforming him into something that might survive. Fair trade, maybe, if you squint at the moral calculus hard enough. Except Simon is also thinking about penguins. Why penguins? He's never been particularly interested in penguins. But now they seem important, vital somehow, like the answer to a question he's forgetting how to ask. The crown's influence makes everything feel simultaneously profound and absurd, meaningful and ridiculous, like the universe's worst inside joke where he's both the comedian and the punchline. Another missile screams overhead. Simon watches it arc across the green sky like a falling star designed by committee in a defense contractor's nightmare. It impacts somewhere north of the city, and the horizon lights up with familiar terrible beauty. He needs to leave, needs to find shelter, find survivors, find something worth surviving for. The crown agrees, in its wordless crystalline way. It pushes him toward the door, toward action, toward a future that extends far beyond this moment of collective extinction. Simon grabs his backpack, already packed because some paranoid part of him saw this coming, and heads into the hallway. His neighbour's door is open, apartment empty. Either they evacuated or they're past evacuating. He doesn't let himself look too closely at the shapes on the floor that might be bodies, or might be shadows, or might be something worse. The stairwell smells like ozone and smoke and human fear made tangible. Simon descends, counting steps because the crown likes patterns, likes order, likes reducing chaos to mathematical sequences. 97 steps from his floor to the ground. 97 chances to reconsider. 97 moments where he could take off the crown and face whatever comes with his mind intact. He reaches the lobby still wearing it. In the land where everything ends. The street is worse than his window view suggested. It's not just chaos, it's the active dissolution of the social contract. The moment when every human being simultaneously realizes that laws and customs and polite behavior were always just collective agreements that require electricity in grocery stores and the promise of tomorrow to maintain. Simon sees things he'll spend centuries trying to forget, except the crown won't let him forget properly. It'll twist the memories, recontextualize them, turn human tragedy into fairy tale motifs until he can't remember if the burning bodies were real or just metaphors for transformation. A child is crying in a doorway, maybe 5 years old, face streaked with tears and ash. No parents visible. Simon approaches, and the crown makes his voice sound wrong, too jovial, too sing-song, like he's greeting a student instead of confronting the apocalypse. "Hey there, little one. Seems like things are pretty intense right now, huh?" The child stares at him with eyes too old for their face. They've seen something children shouldn't see. Then again, what child in the next few hours won't see something that scars them forever, assuming they live long enough to be scarred? Simon kneels down, and ice spreads from where his knees touch the pavement. The child notices but doesn't run. Shock, probably. Or maybe the crown makes him seem safe despite the obvious wrongness of ice forming on asphalt during summer apocalypse. "I'm Simon," he says, and realizes he's introducing himself to a child during the end of the world like it's a faculty mixer. "I'm going to find somewhere safe. Would you like to come with me?" The child doesn't answer with words, just reaches up with small arms and Simon lifts them. They're too light. Probably haven't eaten in days. The city's supply chains collapsed before the bombs even started falling. War doesn't begin with explosions. It begins with empty shelves and panicked hoarding, and the gradual realization that civilization is thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Simon walks. He doesn't know where he's walking toward, but the crown seems to have opinions. It guides him away from the worst fires, away from the crowds that have turned violent, away from the places where radiation is already making the air taste like metal and mutation. They pass a convenience store that's been looted down to the bare shelves. A pharmacy with its windows smashed, medication scattered across the floor like candy. A park where someone has spray-painted "God is dead and we killed him" across the jungle gym, which seems both philosophically accurate and unnecessarily nihilistic given that everyone can see the mushroom clouds without editorial commentary. The child in Simon's arms starts singing, quietly at first, then louder. It's a song about sunshine and happiness and all the things that definitely aren't happening right now. Simon recognizes it from children's television, from back when television showed things besides apocalypse coverage. He finds himself singing along, and the crown makes his voice carry. People hear it, survivors huddled in doorways, families clutching each other in basements, the dying and the not yet dying, and the already dead who haven't stopped moving. Some of them cry, some of them laugh, some of them join in, turning the song into a ragged chorus that echoes down streets lined with burning cars. It's absurd. It's inappropriate. It's exactly the kind of surreal juxtaposition that will define the world that comes after. Beauty and horror sharing the same space, refusing to be separated because why should tragedy and joy respect boundaries when reality itself is negotiable? The seeds of tomorrow. Simon walks for hours, or maybe days. Time feels different now, stretched and compressed like taffy pulled by a particularly vindictive candy maker. The child eventually tells him their name, but the crown immediately files it under cute noise instead of important information, and Simon will spend the next 1,000 years unable to remember if he saved anyone during the apocalypse, or just carried a trauma hallucination through burning streets. They find others. A teenager with a broken arm, an elderly woman who insists on bringing her cat, a man in a business suit who's somehow still carrying his briefcase like he might need those quarterly reports after civilization finishes dying. Simon collects them, his crown growing colder and more insistent, his thoughts fragmenting into ice crystals that sparkle with madness. Somewhere in the distance, the final bombs fall. The biggest ones, the reality-breaking ones. The warheads that don't just destroy matter but punch holes in the fabric of existence itself. Simon feels it when one of them detonates, feels the universe shudder, feels magic flood through the cracks, feels something worse than death wake up and take notice of the sudden vacuum where humanity's future used to be. The sky turns colours that shouldn't exist. Green and purple and a shade of wrong that makes Simon's rescued group whimper and pray to gods who are presumably too busy to answer given the circumstances. Mushroom clouds bloom like gardens designed by entropy, spreading fallout and impossibility in equal measure. And through it all, Simon holds the child and sings songs and slowly forgets what he's supposed to be remembering. The crown digs deeper, rewrites him from the inside out, turns the man who loved Betty into something that will eventually forget her name but never stop missing her. Years later, decades later, centuries later, someone will ask Ice King why he collects princesses. And he won't remember that it started here, in the apocalypse, when he held a child and promised to keep them safe. Won't remember that every princess he kidnaps is an echo of that first rescue, that desperate attempt to save someone, anyone, from the end of everything. But that's tomorrow's tragedy. Tonight is about survival, about walking through hell with a crown that promises immortality at the cost of everything that makes immortality worth having. About watching the world end and realizing that endings are just beginnings viewed from the wrong angle. Simon finds a shelter eventually. A bunker built by someone paranoid enough to prepare but not paranoid enough to be here when the preparation mattered. He gets his group inside, seals the door and sits in the darkness listening to them breathe while the crown whispers lullabies about ice and winter and the beautiful emptiness that comes when you finally stop fighting and let the cold consume you. Outside, the Great Mushroom War finishes killing the world. Inside, Simon Petrikov takes his first real steps toward becoming the Ice King. And somewhere, somehow, the seeds of Ooo begin to germinate in radioactive soil. The apocalypse tasted like bubblegum and regret, and nobody would understand that joke for another 1,000 years. The world before the Great Mushroom War looked almost exactly like ours, which is the most terrifying part. No dystopian warning signs, no obvious villains twirling mustaches and planning global destruction. Just people going to work, paying taxes, falling in love, and slowly building toward extinction without realizing the scaffolding was made of dynamite. Simon Petrikov's life in this pre-war world was quietly extraordinary, in the way academic lives often are, full of obscure triumphs that matter intensely to 17 people globally. He had tenure at a respectable university, a small apartment filled with artifacts that ranged from legitimately ancient to probably cursed, and a partner who was brilliant enough to challenge him and patient enough to tolerate his obsessions. Betty Groff was not Simon's assistant, despite how their story sometimes gets told. She was a researcher in her own right, specialising in petroglyphs and indigenous Australian archaeology, with publications that made Simon's look pedestrian by comparison. They met at a conference in Rome where Simon was presenting on Norse magical practices, and Betty stood up during the Q&A to politely demolish his interpretation of a particular rune sequence. He fell in love somewhere between her third counter-argument and her suggestion that they continue the discussion over drinks. Their relationship was built on intellectual sparring, shared fascination with the inexplicable, and the kind of partnership where you can spend 14 hours in a dusty archive and consider it a perfect date. Betty understood Simon's obsessions because she had her own. She once spent 6 months in the Australian outback documenting rock art that local Aboriginal elders insisted was cursed, and came back with photographs that made even Simon nervous. This was the world, researchers pursuing obscure knowledge, artists creating beauty nobody asked for, engineers solving problems that hadn't quite become crises yet. Normal, functional, slowly unravelling at the edges, but who wasn't? The cracks in reality magic was seeping into the world long before the bombs fell, but most people didn't notice. How could they? Magic looks like coincidence when you're not paying attention. A statue that seemed to move when nobody was watching. Ancient texts that predicted events with uncomfortable accuracy. Artifacts that felt wrong in ways that scientific instruments couldn't measure. Simon's research brought him into contact with these anomalies regularly. The Enchiridion, that ancient book of heroism and mystical wisdom, passed through his hands briefly during an estate sale. He spent 3 days photographing every page, translating what he could, and feeling increasingly certain that whoever wrote it wasn't speaking metaphorically about magical powers and cosmic forces. The book claimed there were rules to heroism, actual mystical laws that governed how righteousness functioned in the universe. Simon thought it was fascinating mythology. He didn't realise it was an instruction manual for a world that didn't exist yet. Other artifacts circulated through the antiquarian community with increasing frequency. Crowns that lowered room temperature, swords that hummed with inner light, amulets that made wearers feel emotions that didn't have names. The academic consensus was that these were elaborate forgeries or objects with unusual physical properties that primitive cultures mistook for magic. Nobody wanted to admit that magic was real because that would mean rethinking everything, and academia runs on the assumption that we've mostly figured things out, with just some details left to clarify. Betty was more open to possibilities. She'd spent time with communities who treated the spiritual world as simply another layer of reality. No more mysterious than quantum mechanics and considerably more practical for daily life. She collected stories about objects of power, places where reality felt thinner, instances where the impossible happened and everyone just shrugged and adapted. "What if magic isn't coming back?" she asked Simon once, late at night in his apartment, surrounded by artifacts and books and empty coffee cups. What if it never left? What if we just convinced ourselves it wasn't real because that was easier than dealing with the implications? Simon laughed it off. He was a scientist first, even if his science involved translating dead languages and handling cursed objects. Magic was metaphor, symbol, the way primitive minds processed natural phenomena they didn't understand. He was so confident about that right up until he put on the ice crown and froze his entire apartment solid. The geopolitical powder keg. While Simon and Betty pursued obscure knowledge, the world pursued its oldest hobby, finding reasons to kill each other at scale. The geopolitical situation in the years before the war was less Cold War and more lukewarm war, slowly reaching boiling point. Old powers clung to relevance. New powers demanded recognition. Resources grew scarcer, or at least the willingness to share them did. Climate change wasn't a future threat anymore, but a present crisis that nations blamed on each other, with increasing hostility. Borders shifted, alliances fractured. The United Nations held emergency sessions so frequently that emergency lost all meaning. The technology level was advanced enough to be dangerous, but not advanced enough to solve the problems that made people want to use it dangerously. Nuclear arsenals remained massive, maintained through a combination of deterrence theory and bureaucratic inertia. Conventional weapons grew more precise and more devastating. Satellite networks turned the planet into a surveillance grid, where every nation watched every other nation, and nobody trusted what they were seeing. Artificial intelligence wasn't quite sentient, but was definitely getting ideas. Biotechnology could cure diseases and also create new ones that made old plagues look quaint. Nanotechnology promised revolution and delivered mostly hype plus occasional horrifying accidents that got classified immediately. In short, humanity had achieved the technological capability to destroy itself several times over, while remaining emotionally and politically stuck in patterns established when the deadliest weapon was a really sharp rock. The specific triggers for the war are still debated by the 3 historians left alive in Ooo who care about such things. Was it resources? Ideology? A series of escalating accidents that spiraled beyond anyone's control? The evidence suggests all of the above, combined with the special human talent for taking bad situations and making them catastrophically worse through pride, fear, and the inability to back down once you've committed to a position. What's known is that tensions built for years, proxy wars in regions that didn't want to be proxies, economic sanctions that hurt civilians while leaders dined on imported luxuries, assassination attempts, both successful and failed, diplomatic incidents that would be comedy if they weren't preludes to tragedy. The mushroom clouds didn't appear suddenly. They appeared at the end of a very long fuse that everyone could see burning, but nobody could agree on how to extinguish. Marceline's world before the fall. Somewhere in this pre-war world, a little girl named Marceline lived with her human mother, completely unaware that she was half demon and destined to outlive everyone she'd ever love. Her mother was just a person, not a hero, not a villain, not anyone who'd show up in history books. A woman trying to raise a daughter in a world that was getting progressively more unstable and frightening. The details are sparse because Marceline doesn't talk about this period much, and when she does, it's in the fragments of someone who was too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to remember the fear. They lived in a city, maybe Los Angeles, maybe somewhere else. Geography matters less when everywhere is equally doomed. Marceline's mother worked, probably multiple jobs because half-demon children don't make themselves invisible in polite society, and rent doesn't pay itself even in the apocalypse's opening act. Marceline's demon heritage wasn't obvious yet. She looked human enough, ate normal food, didn't float or crave red things. Her father, Hunson Abadir, was absent in the way powerful beings are absent. Not dead, not gone, just somewhere else doing something more important, which in his case meant ruling the nightosphere and occasionally popping into reality to be spectacularly terrible at parenting. The mother-daughter relationship was normal in the best sense. Bedtime stories, arguments about homework, teaching Marceline to ride a bike while hoping the world would last long enough for her to get a driver's license someday. The ordinary love that becomes extraordinary only when you realise how fragile it was, how close to ending, how every moment of normalcy was borrowed time. As tensions escalated globally, Marceline's mother tried to shield her from it, turned off the news when the reports got too frightening, made up explanations for why they needed to keep extra food stored, why they were learning to purify water, why Mommy was teaching her which plants were safe to eat and which weren't. Survival skills disguised as fun activities, because what else do you do when the world is ending but try to prepare your child while preserving some shred of their innocence? The technology that failed to save us. The pre-war world had technology that would seem like magic to earlier generations. Devices that fit in pockets and connected to global networks. Medicine that could cure diseases that used to be death sentences. Transportation that moved people across continents in hours. The ability to sequence DNA, split atoms, and peer into the cosmic microwave background radiation to understand the universe's birth. None of it mattered when the missiles launched. Technology is only as good as the wisdom of those wielding it, and humanity remained fundamentally unwise. We built networks that could share information at light speed, but used them primarily for arguing and cat videos. We created abundance but distributed it so poorly that people starved while others debated which of their 3 cars to drive. We mapped the human genome but couldn't figure out how to stop shooting each other over territory that would be radioactive wasteland within the decade. The irony is that the same technology that couldn't prevent the war ensured it would be absolutely devastating when it came. Modern warheads weren't your grandfather's atomic bombs. They were precision instruments of mass destruction, designed by committees of very smart people who apparently never stopped to ask if they should be designing them at all. Missile defense systems existed but were optimized for limited strikes, not the comprehensive global exchange that actually happened. Early warning networks detected launches but couldn't prevent them. Communication technology allowed world leaders to call each other right up until the moment they decided killing each other was more satisfying than talking. And then there were the experimental weapons, the classified projects, the things nations built in secret because they were too horrible to build in public. Biological agents that blurred the line between disease and deliberate malice. Chemical weapons that made traditional poisons look gentle. And the mushroom bomb itself. That special warhead that wasn't just nuclear but something worse. Something that would punch holes in reality and let magic flood through like water through a cracked dam. The final days of normal. The last few weeks before the war had a surreal quality that survivors would remember for centuries. Everyone knew something terrible was coming, but life continued with desperate normalcy. People went to work because what else would they do? Students attended classes, couples got married. Babies were born into a world that would be ashes before they learned to walk. Simon and Betty had their final argument during this period. Not about the crown directly. Simon had already bought it, already started experimenting with it, already felt it changing him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The argument was about priorities, about his increasing obsession with magical artifacts while the world burned, about how he was choosing research over reality. "You're not even here anymore," Betty told him, and she didn't mean physically. She meant the way his eyes glazed over mid-conversation, the way he'd forget things they'd discussed hours earlier, the way he kept the crown in his apartment even though it clearly disturbed him, and every time he wore it he came back slightly different, slightly colder, slightly less Simon. He promised to lock it away. He didn't. She left for her expedition shortly after, a research trip to document megalithic sites in Southeast Asia that probably didn't need documenting with quite such urgency, except that it got her away from Simon and his spiral into obsession. The expedition was supposed to last 3 months. She'd been gone 6 weeks when the bombs started falling. Marceline's mother spent the final days preparing in the way people prepare when they know preparation is futile, but the alternative is paralysis. She filled the bathtub with water, stocked the pantry, taught Marceline one more song about sunshine, because if the world was ending, at least they could end it together with music. Across the planet, similar scenes played out. Families gathering, friends saying goodbyes that felt too final. People making peace with whatever gods or philosophies sustained them. Some fled to bunkers, some to rural areas, some stayed exactly where they were because running requires believing there's somewhere to run to. And then the sky turned green, and the before became after, and the world that was turned into the world that would be. The weight of what was lost. Here's the thing about pre-war Earth that makes its loss especially cruel. It wasn't a utopia. It was flawed, struggling, full of injustice and inequality and systems that ground people down. But it was also full of beauty nobody asked for and kindness nobody required. Artists creating for the sake of creation. Scientists pursuing knowledge that wouldn't profit anyone. Ordinary people performing small acts of grace because what else is civilization but the collective agreement to be decent to each other even when it's inconvenient. All of that ended. The museums with their preserved history, the libraries full of recorded wisdom, the concert halls where music happened, the laboratories where researchers chased cures, the small bakeries that made bread exactly the same way for 4 generations. The grandmother teaching her granddaughter to knit while telling stories about great-grandparents who crossed oceans seeking better lives. Gone. Not just destroyed, but erased so thoroughly that 1,000 years later, the Land of Ooo would barely remember it existed. Princess Bubblegum would eventually discover pre-war ruins and treat them as alien artifacts from an incomprehensible civilization. Finn would grow up in a world shaped entirely by the war's aftermath, without understanding what was lost. Even Marceline, who lived through it, would have her memories filtered through centuries of trauma and adaptation, until the before times felt more like dream than history. The tragedy isn't just that humanity destroyed itself. Species go extinct. Civilizations collapse. That's the natural order of things. The tragedy is that we did it to ourselves, quickly, efficiently, with weapons we built specifically for the purpose. We looked at the accumulated knowledge of millennia and said, yes, but what if we used all this to create better ways to murder each other at scale? And we did, and it worked. And the world that came after was beautiful and strange and deeply weird, but it wasn't the world that had Simon Petrikov and Betty Groff arguing about magical artifacts while falling in love. It wasn't the world where Marceline's mother sang lullabies and hoped her daughter would grow up normal. It wasn't the world that built cathedrals and composed symphonies and wrote poetry and painted masterpieces and did all the inexplicable things humans do when they're not busy destroying each other. That world ended, and maybe the Land of Ooo is better in some ways, more magical, more whimsical, more full of talking candy people and stretchy dogs. But you can't help wondering what would have happened if Simon had never bought the crown, if Betty hadn't left, if world leaders had found one more way to de-escalate, if someone, somewhere, had been brave enough to say no before the missiles launched. But they didn't, and the before became the after, and all that remains are fragments, Simon's video messages, ancient ruins, Marceline's songs about a mother who died protecting her from radiation, and the lingering question of whether knowing what was lost makes the present sweeter or more bitter. The answer, like most things in Adventure Time, is probably both. Simon Petrikov didn't become the Ice King all at once. That would have been kinder in a way. A clean transformation, one person ending and another beginning, like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, except the butterfly is an insane wizard, and the chrysalis is the shredded remains of everything you used to be. Instead, it happened in pieces. Small losses that accumulated like frost on a window, each one barely noticeable until suddenly you can't see through the glass anymore, and you've forgotten what you were trying to look at in the first place. The first time Simon wore the crown after the bombs fell, he told himself it was temporary, just until he got his group of survivors to safety, just until the radiation levels dropped, just until he could figure out what to do next. Temporary is the lie every addict tells themselves, and the crown was the most patient dealer in history. It could wait. It had all the time in the world, and soon so would Simon. The crown's power was undeniable. When Simon wore it, radiation couldn't touch him. Heat couldn't harm him. The poisoned air that was killing people in slow, agonizing ways became irrelevant because his lungs now breathed something colder than oxygen, something that sustained him in ways biology couldn't explain. He could create ice from nothing, shape it into walls that blocked fallout, freeze contaminated water until it became pure enough to drink. He saved lives. That's what he told himself every time he felt the crown digging deeper into his mind. Every person he pulled from the rubble, every child he shielded from radiation burns, every survivor he guided to relative safety. That justified the cost, didn't it? What's one person's sanity against dozens of lives preserved? Except the math doesn't work that way. You can't balance ledgers when the currency is your own identity. The gradual erosion. The changes started subtle. Simon would forget words mid-sentence and substitute strange ones that didn't quite fit. He'd call Betty Princess in his video diary, then catch himself and apologise to the camera, to the recording that would outlive his ability to remember why he was recording it. His body temperature dropped, not just when wearing the crown, but always, permanently, as if the cold was leaking into his baseline existence. His rescued group noticed, of course they noticed, but survival makes people willing to overlook a lot. So their protector was getting weird and obsessed with ice. At least he could create shelter when everywhere else was radioactive ash. The child Simon had rescued, the one whose name he couldn't quite hold on to, became a fixture in his care. But his relationship with them started changing in ways that disturbed him when he was lucid enough to notice. He'd catch himself talking to the child like they were a subject in his kingdom, rather than a scared kid who needed actual parenting. He'd call them Little One, or Small Subject, instead of their name, which he could no longer access even when he wasn't wearing the crown. The video messages to Betty became longer and more desperate. Simon recorded them obsessively, trying to document his degradation before he lost the ability to understand what was happening to him. These recordings would eventually become the Holly Jolly Secrets tapes, the most heartbreaking documentary ever filed under Christmas content, because Ice King had lost all context for what they actually were. In the messages, you can watch Simon age in reverse emotionally. The early ones show a man still in control, rationally explaining the situation. The middle ones show someone fighting to maintain coherence while reality warps around him. The final ones show someone who barely remembers who Betty is, but knows with terrible certainty that losing her matters more than anything, except he can't remember why. "Betty, I'm recording this so that you'll understand why I changed," Simon says in one video, his breath visible in the heated bunker, because even without the crown he's becoming ice incarnate. "The crown is affecting my mind. I think I'm going crazy. I need you to know that when you come back and I don't recognise you, it's not because I stopped loving you. It's because I loved you so much that I chose to forget you rather than die, and leave the world with one less person trying to help." He cries during that recording, ice tears that don't melt even after they fall. Marceline appears. Marceline entered Simon's life approximately 6 months after the bombs fell, though time was already becoming unreliable for him. He found her in the ruins of what used to be a suburb, a little girl maybe 6 or 7 years old sitting next to a woman who wasn't breathing anymore. The woman was Marceline's mother. She'd gotten them both to shelter during the initial blasts, rationed their supplies perfectly, done everything right according to the disaster preparedness guides that assumed disasters would be temporary. But radiation is patient and thorough, and eventually even the best prepared parent succumbs while their half-demon daughter remains alive and confused about why Mommy won't wake up. Simon approached carefully, the crown already making his social instincts unreliable. "Hello there," he said, his voice carrying too much forced cheer. "Seems like you're having a rough day." Marceline looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared at this strange man with white hair and blue skin who radiated cold like a refrigerator left open in hell. Simon knelt down next to the dead woman, Marceline's mother, though he didn't know that yet, and checked for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there. The radiation signs were obvious: hair loss, skin lesions, the particular grey pallor that meant your cells had stopped pretending to function correctly. "I'm sorry," Simon told the corpse, and meant it. Then to Marceline, "Your mother was very brave. She protected you as long as she could." Marceline's first words to him were, "She told me to be good." "Then you should be good," Simon agreed. "But first you should come with me. I know somewhere safer than here." "Will you leave me too?" Marceline asked, and the question hit Simon harder than any radiation ever could. "No," he promised, and the crown whispered agreement because it loved promises that would take centuries to fulfill. "I'll stay with you. I'll keep you safe. I won't leave you alone." It was the most important promise Simon Petrikov ever made, and he kept it, sort of. He did stay with Marceline, did protect her, did refuse to leave her alone. But the man who made the promise gradually ceased to exist, replaced by someone who couldn't remember why the little dark-haired girl mattered, but knew with frozen certainty that she did. The in-between years, Simon and Marceline's early relationship was surprisingly functional given the circumstances. He taught her survival skills filtered through increasingly bizarre lesson plans. How to purify water, which somehow became a lecture about ice crystal formations and whether snowflakes have feelings. How to identify edible plants, which devolved into Simon insisting that princesses only eat royal vegetables, and Marceline needed to find princess-appropriate food sources. She adapted to his weirdness, because what choice did she have? In a world where everything familiar had been destroyed, a kind wizard slowly losing his mind was still better than being alone. And Simon was kind, even as he fragmented. He sang to her when she had nightmares. He created ice sculptures to entertain her. He made up stories about princesses and heroes and happy endings because someone needed to remember that such things had once existed. The problem was the crown's influence kept growing. Simon would have good days where he was almost himself, lucid and caring and painfully aware of what he was losing. Then he'd have bad days where he was more crown than man, acting out patterns that didn't make sense, calling Marceline princess unironically, building ice kingdoms from rubble, and declaring himself ruler of wastelands. Marceline learned to navigate his moods. When Simon was himself, they'd have real conversations about the world before, about her mother, about all the things they'd lost. When he was mostly crown, she'd play along with whatever fantasy he'd constructed, understanding, even as a child, that arguing with madness just makes it defensive. He taught her to play guitar during a lucid period, saying that music was one of the few things that couldn't be destroyed by radiation or time or curses. She learned quickly, finding in music something she could control when everything else was chaos. Later, much later, when Simon had fully become Ice King, she'd use that guitar to play him songs about their time together, hoping the music might reach whatever remained of the man who saved her. But that's a tragedy for a different section. For now, they had each other. A slowly maddening wizard and a half-demon child, wandering through radioactive ruins, singing songs and building shelters and pretending the world made sense. The video messages as memorial. The Holly Jolly Secrets tapes became Simon's attempt to preserve himself in amber. If he couldn't maintain his sanity, at least he could record it, create evidence that Simon Petrikov had existed and mattered, and loved someone named Betty, who he was forgetting in real time. "Betty, I have to record these messages," he explains in one tape, Marceline visible in the background playing with ice sculptures. "Because I'm losing time. Days disappear. I'll put on the crown to protect us from raiders or radiation or weather, and when I take it off, weeks have passed and I don't remember any of it. The crown is editing my life, and I'm running out of original footage." The metaphor would be clever if it wasn't so devastating. In another message, recorded maybe 2 years into the post-war period, Simon is struggling to maintain his train of thought. He keeps pausing mid-sentence, staring into space, then snapping back to awareness with visible effort. "I think I called Marceline Gunther today," he admits. "I don't know why. Who's Gunther? Is that someone I knew?" The crown keeps filling my head with nonsense words that feel important but mean nothing. Or maybe they mean something and I've forgotten the context. I can't tell anymore. He pauses, and you can see him fighting to stay present. "Betty, if you find these tapes after I'm gone, after I'm completely gone, I mean, not dead, but gone in the way that matters, please know I tried. I tried so hard to stay myself. But the crown is stronger than me, and every day it gets a little bit harder to remember why staying myself matters more than keeping Marceline safe. And she needs me. She needs someone. Her mother is dead. Her father is... I don't actually know what her father is. She won't talk about him. But she's alone except for me, and if I take off the crown permanently, we'll both die because I can't survive the radiation without it." The choice crystallizes in that moment, preserved on magnetic tape for eternity. Die as Simon and leave Marceline alone, or live as something else and at least keep one promise even if you forget making it. He chose wrong. Or right. Or both simultaneously, which is how the worst choices usually work, when the name became noise. The exact moment Simon forgot Betty's name isn't recorded. There's no dramatic scene where his memory fails catastrophically. Instead, there's a gap in the video messages. 3 months, maybe 4. Hard to tell because timestamps stop making sense when the person recording no longer understands calendars. When he appears again on camera, something fundamental has shifted. He's still recognisably Simon in appearance, still has moments of clarity, but the baseline has moved. He's operating from further away now, like someone trying to have a conversation from the bottom of a frozen lake. "I need to tell you something," he says to the camera, to Betty, to the recording that serves as substitute for the relationship he's lost. "Your name? I had it this morning. I know I did. It started with B, or maybe M. It was a happy sound, a warm sound. But now it's just noise, and I can feel the crown laughing at me because it knows that once I've forgotten your name, the rest of you follows." He's crying again. Always crying in the later videos because grief is the last emotion to go, apparently. You can forget who you're grieving for while the grief itself remains, floating free, attaching to princesses and ice sculptures and whatever the crown decides deserves your incomprehensible longing. "I love you," Simon says, and even he seems uncertain about who he's addressing. "I loved you. I will love you when this is over." All of those are true. Time doesn't work right anymore. Past, present, future, they're all happening simultaneously, and in all of them I'm losing you in slightly different ways. Marceline finds him after that recording, sitting in the dark holding the camera like it might provide answers. She's older now, maybe 10 or 11, already developing the defensive sarcasm that will define her immortal personality. "You okay, Simon?" she asks, because even though he's been calling her various princess-related nicknames for months, she still uses his real name, still tries to anchor him to who he was. "I forgot something important," he tells her. "You forget lots of things. This was different. This was a person. Someone I loved." Marceline sits down next to him, and they share silence because sometimes that's all you can offer someone who's drowning. Eventually she starts playing guitar, and Simon hums along, and for a moment they're just two survivors making music in the dark because what else is there? The final lucid moment. Simon's last truly coherent message comes approximately 5 years post-war. Marceline is a teenager now, capable of surviving without him, which is good because he's barely Simon anymore. The man recording this final message knows it's final, can feel the crown's complete victory approaching like a slow-motion avalanche. "If you're watching this, whoever you are, I need you to know something," he says, addressing an audience that's expanded beyond Betty because he can't quite remember who Betty is anymore, just that she mattered. The crown protects you, but protection has costs that compound interest until you owe more than you can ever repay. He's chosen his words carefully, clinging to coherence through sheer determination. "I saved a little girl named Marceline. I kept her safe through the end of the world. That's worth something, isn't it? That has to count for something. Even if I forget her name tomorrow, even if I forget my own name, even if I spend the next 1,000 years as a mad wizard, kidnapping princesses and building ice kingdoms from insanity, I saved her. I kept my promise. I didn't leave her alone." The justification of someone who knows they're about to lose everything. So if you find these tapes, if you're the Ice King wondering who you used to be, remember this. You were a good man who made impossible choices. You sacrificed yourself for someone else. That's heroic, even if heroism looks like madness from the outside. He pauses, struggling for the words that will bridge the gap between who he is and who he's becoming. And if you're Betty, if you somehow survived and found your way back and you're watching this, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have destroyed the crown when you asked. I should have chosen you over the research, over the artifacts, over the obsessive need to understand magic. You were right about everything, and I loved you more than I loved being right, but I couldn't figure out how to show you that before the world ended. It's the last time the name Betty appears in the recordings with full recognition and context. After this, there are more videos, but they're Ice King talking to himself about princess kidnapping strategies and ice construction techniques and whether penguins appreciate jazz music. Simon Petrikov is gone, leaving only frozen fragments that occasionally catch the light in ways that suggest coherence, the transformation, Complete Ice King doesn't remember becoming Ice King. That's the mercy and the cruelty simultaneously. One day you're Simon fighting to maintain yourself, and the next day you're someone else wearing Simon's memories like an ice sculpture wears water. Technically the same substance, but fundamentally transformed, unable to return to the original state without destroying what you've become. Marceline watched it happen. Watched her protector, her father figure, the man who saved her and sang to her and taught her guitar, slowly dissolve into a ridiculous wizard obsessed with kidnapping princesses. She watched him forget her name, forget their history together, forget everything except a vague sense that young women were important and should probably be kept in ice castles, for reasons he could no longer articulate. The tragedy is that Ice King is happier than Simon ever was. Madness came with a side effect of obliviousness. He doesn't remember what he's lost because memory requires continuity, and the crown shattered that into crystalline fragments that catch light beautifully, but cut deep when you try to hold them. He builds kingdoms from ice and declares himself royalty. He writes truly terrible fan fiction about adventurers he'll meet in the future. He kidnaps princesses not because he understands romance, but because the crown remembers Simon loved someone once, and translated that into acquire female royalty through dubious means. He's lonely in ways he can't articulate. Surrounded by penguins he's named Gunter, for reasons even he doesn't understand, singing songs whose melodies he recalls, but whose meanings have evaporated like snow in summer. And somewhere deep in the ice, buried under centuries of accumulated madness, Simon Petrikov still exists. Not conscious, not coherent, but present in the way sediment remains in ice cores. Compressed, preserved, evidence of what came before. When Marceline plays guitar and sings about fries and ketchup, about daddies playing games, about apologies between people who don't remember why they're apologizing, something in Ice King resonates without understanding why. That's the real curse of the crown. Not transformation, but incomplete transformation. If it had completely erased Simon, that would be clean. Instead, it leaves ghosts of him, haunting Ice King with emotions he can't source, and longing he can't satisfy, and the persistent feeling that he's forgotten something important, but the forgetting itself has been forgotten. If you forget everyone you loved, are you still you? Or are you just a collection of behaviours that used to have context, performing patterns for an audience that left long ago? The answer is both, which is the worst answer possible. The first missile launched at 14:47 GMT on a Tuesday afternoon, which proves that apocalypses don't wait for dramatically appropriate timing. No ominous midnight launch, no dawn breaking over a doomed world, just middle of the workday on a random weekday, when half the planet was eating lunch and the other half was sleeping through alarm clocks they'd never need again. The missile was fired from a submarine somewhere in the Pacific, responding to intelligence that turned out to be incorrect, but by then correctness was irrelevant because the retaliation protocols activated automatically, and suddenly everyone was launching everything at everyone else, with the efficiency of a species that had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. Within 6 minutes, the sky belonged to missiles. Within 20 minutes, the first warheads detonated. Within an hour, the concept of winning became obsolete because there were no winners in a game where the prize was inheriting radioactive wasteland. The Great Mushroom War wasn't a war in any traditional sense. It was a collective suicide pact executed with technological precision and absolutely no plan for what came after, because there wasn't supposed to be an after. The strategists who designed mutually assured destruction never considered that some things might survive, that magic might flood through the cracks, that reality itself might mutate, that the end of humanity could be the beginning of something else entirely. The first 24 hours. Simon watched the first mushroom clouds from his bunker entrance. Marceline not yet in his life, the crown already changing him in ways he was desperately trying to document. He'd gotten his small group of survivors underground just in time, sealing the heavy door against radiation that was already making the air taste metallic and wrong. The clouds bloomed across the horizon like time-lapse footage of deadly flowers. 1, then 3, then too many to count as the exchange escalated beyond any single person's ability to comprehend. Each cloud represented hundreds of thousands of people erased instantly, millions more condemned to slower deaths from radiation, burns, starvation, or simple despair at finding themselves alive in hell. The blasts weren't uniform. Some cities got hit by multiple warheads, because strategic importance is measured in how many times you need to obliterate something to be certain it's obliterated. New York took 7 confirmed strikes. Moscow took 9. Beijing took 11 because somebody was making a point that got lost in the translation from doctrine to devastation. But the mushroom bomb, capital M, capital B, the one that would change everything, that one was different. That one was special. That one wasn't just a weapon, but a key that unlocked doors nobody knew existed, letting things through that should have stayed on the other side of reality. The mushroom bomb detonated over what used to be a major metropolitan area, whose name doesn't matter anymore because names require context, and context requires a civilization that remembers why names mattered. The blast was nuclear at its core, but something was wrong with the payload. Or maybe something was exactly right, depending on your perspective on cosmic horror. The explosion looked green, not the typical orange-red of nuclear fire, but a sickly luminescent green that seemed to absorb light instead of producing it. The mushroom cloud that rose wasn't just smoke and debris, it was reality having a seizure, space-time convulsing as dimensions that usually stayed separated suddenly found themselves forced together like immiscible liquids under impossible pressure. Witnesses who saw it from far enough away to survive reported the cloud moving wrong, pulsing with patterns that hurt to look at, making sounds that registered as smells, and smells that registered as emotions. The blast radius extended further than physics said it should, not through additional explosive force but through reality itself breaking down and deciding that distance was now negotiable. And in that moment of maximum destruction, when atoms split and matter converted to energy, and the universe's fundamental rules became suggestions, something else emerged. Something that had been waiting in the space between existence and non-existence, patient as entropy, ready to take form the moment reality weakened enough to allow it. The Lich, Marceline's last day with her mother across the continent. In a city that was about to stop being a city, Marceline's mother heard the air raid sirens and knew immediately that this wasn't a drill. You could tell from the pitch, from the way the sound carried genuine terror instead of procedural warning. This was the real thing, the scenario they'd practiced but never expected to survive. She grabbed Marceline, who was playing with dolls, whose biggest worry seconds earlier had been whether her toy's hair looked right, and ran for their building's basement. No time for supplies, no time for planning, just desperate maternal math about seconds versus safety. The basement filled quickly with neighbours who'd had the same idea. Families cramming into a space designed for storage, not survival. Someone was crying. A child was asking questions nobody could answer. An elderly man was praying in a language Marceline didn't recognise, his words rhythmic and desperate. "What's happening, Mommy?" Marceline asked. Because children ask questions even when the world is ending, especially when the world is ending. "Something bad, baby," her mother answered, holding her close, "but we're going to be okay. Mummy's got you." The lie was love expressed as fiction. They weren't going to be okay. Nobody in that basement was going to be okay. But sometimes love means lying to children about the approaching darkness, because what else can you do? The first blast hit nearby, close enough that the building shook, far enough that it didn't immediately collapse. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, then failed. Someone's phone provided illumination for a few minutes until the EMP from additional detonations killed all electronics in a radius measured in hundreds of miles. They huddled in darkness while the world ended above them. Each explosion registered as vibration through the floor, through their bodies, through the shared understanding that their city was being systematically destroyed by weapons that had been pointed at them for decades but nobody really believed would fire. Marceline's mother sang to her, quiet songs about sunshine and happiness and all the things that definitely weren't happening. Marceline sang along, her child's voice cutting through the darkness and fear and the sounds of civilization collapsing into rubble. They survived the initial bombardment. That's the cruel part. If they died immediately, it would have been merciful. Instead, they got weeks. Weeks of trying to find uncontaminated food. Weeks of Marceline's mother getting progressively sicker from radiation exposure. Weeks of watching other survivors die slowly while pretending to Marceline that everything would be fine. "Mommy's just tired," she explained when she started coughing blood. Mommy needs to rest, that's all. But rest doesn't fix radiation poisoning. Rest doesn't repair cells that have stopped functioning correctly. Rest is just what you say when dying with dignity in front of your child, trying to model strength until the very end. She lasted 6 months. In some ways, that's impressive. 6 months surviving in post-apocalyptic wasteland with limited supplies and radiation levels that should have killed her faster. In other ways, it's 6 months of suffering, 6 months of knowing she was leaving her daughter alone, 6 months of trying to teach a child survival skills while too weak to demonstrate them properly. "Be good," she told Marceline at the end. Her final words a request that encompassed everything. Be good, be safe, be strong, be someone who survives this. Be proof that I mattered, and our time together wasn't just prelude to tragedy. Then she stopped breathing, and Marceline was alone until a strange man with white hair and frozen eyes found her and promised never to leave her, a promise he kept by losing himself so completely that leaving became impossible. The reality-breaking cascade. The mushroom bomb's detonation didn't just destroy matter, it damaged the structural integrity of reality itself. Think of existence like a wall, and the bomb punched a hole through it, and things from the other side of the wall immediately started flowing through like water through a breach in a dam. Magic had always existed on Earth, but it was background radiation, subtle enough that most people never noticed. Ancient artifacts held power because they were conduits for something that usually stayed diffused and manageable. The crown worked because it channeled this ambient magic into focused effect. But the mushroom bomb changed the concentration. Suddenly magic wasn't background radiation but foreground reality, flooding through the crack in existence with all the subtlety of a tsunami hitting a coastal village. The rules changed. Physics became negotiable. Natural law started taking suggestions from supernatural forces that had been waiting eons for exactly this opportunity. Mutations began immediately. Not the slow genetic drift of evolution, but rapid, impossible transformations driven by magic interfering with biology. People in the blast radius who somehow survived the initial destruction found themselves changing, warping, becoming things that didn't have names yet because language evolves slower than apocalypse. Some mutations were beneficial in the sense that they allowed survival, radiation resistance, ability to process contaminated food, altered metabolisms that required less oxygen or water. Some were horrifying, flesh that kept growing in patterns that served no function, limbs that multiplied or vanished, faces that rearranged themselves according to geometric principles that biology never intended. And some mutations were just weird. People whose skin turned candy-coloured. People who started secreting sugar compounds. People who lost physical cohesion and became semi-liquid but somehow remained conscious and functional. The line between biology and confection blurred, aided by magic that didn't care about scientific categories. The candy people's origins trace back to this moment. Post-war survivors stumbling through radioactive ruins, their biology breaking down under radiation exposure, magic flooding into the gaps and deciding that if cells were going to mutate anyway, why not mutate deliciously? Consciousness preserved in sugar-based matrices, personalities transferred into gummy bodies, humanity continuing in the most absurd possible form. Princess Bubblegum wouldn't emerge for centuries, but her eventual existence was encoded here, in this moment when magic looked at dying humans and offered alternatives that range from grotesque to adorable, with nothing in between. Survivors in the dark. The bunkers worked, technically. People who made it underground with sufficient supplies and shielding survived the initial bombardment and the immediate radiation. But survival and living aren't the same thing, and the bunkers became tombs that happened to contain breathing corpses. Air filtration systems broke down. Water supplies got contaminated. Food ran out faster than planned because nobody planned for complete civilization collapse. Some bunkers turned violent as resources dwindled and people reverted to the oldest human solution to scarcity, killing each other over canned goods and bottled water. Other bunkers maintained order through sheer stubborn humanity. Rationing protocols, democratic decision-making, schedules that preserved routine because routine is how you stay sane underground while the world burns. These communities survived longer but not forever, because eventually the supplies ended and someone had to venture outside into the wasteland. What they found was Earth transformed, the sky wrong colours, the air thick with particulates that made breathing painful, radiation hot enough that prolonged exposure meant slow death, and everywhere, the evidence that humanity had succeeded brilliantly at destroying itself. Cities were rubble, roads were craters, rivers ran colours that water shouldn't be. The ocean, when survivors made it to coastlines, looked sick and angry, waves moving in patterns that suggested the water itself was traumatised by what it now contained. But there was also beauty in the destruction, which is maybe the most disturbing part. Sunsets spectacular beyond anything pre-war Earth ever produced because atmospheric particulates scatter light in ways that create colours that don't have names. Northern lights extending far beyond their normal range because the magnetosphere was damaged and solar radiation was getting through in patterns that painted the sky. Radiation making things glow with bioluminescence that was definitely killing you but looked incredible while doing it. Adventure Time's visual aesthetic, those impossible colour gradients, that perpetual golden hour lighting, that sense of world existing in permanent magic hour, originates here, in the apocalypse's immediate aftermath when physics broke down enough to let aesthetics leak through from dimensions where beauty and horror aren't opposites but dance partners. The dead who wouldn't stay. Dead one immediate effect of magic flooding into reality was that death stopped being entirely definite. The boundaries between life and afterlife, always somewhat porous according to various religious traditions, became actively permeable. Dead people sometimes just got up and kept going, not as zombies in the traditional sense, but as something else, something magical, something that Adventure Time would eventually categorize as ghosts, but really meant consciousness that refused to dissipate despite biological function ceasing. The dead worlds began forming in those first days, parallel dimensions where the deceased collected, not quite afterlife in the theological sense, but more like reality's lost and found department for souls that didn't have anywhere else to go. Death himself, the cosmic entity, the skeleton in the suit, found his workload suddenly overwhelming because humans were dying faster than cosmic bureaucracy could process them. This wasn't in the job description, Death would later complain to anyone who'd listen, which wasn't many beings because most entities capable of conversation with death were either already dead or too busy managing their own post-apocalyptic crises. The Nightosphere, Marceline's father's domain, became more accessible from Earth because dimensional barriers weakened along with everything else. Hunson Abadir suddenly found the mortal realm easier to visit, which should have made him a more present father, but mostly just made him more efficiently absent because proximity doesn't fix fundamental personality flaws. Other dimensions opened up similarly. The crystal dimension, the lumpy space, various pocket realities that had been sealed or distant suddenly became neighbours. Earth wasn't just destroyed, it was relocated metaphysically, moved into a neighbourhood with properties it had never noticed before because the walls between worlds had been soundproof, and now they were Swiss cheese. 24 hours later. Taking stock. By the end of the first day, humanity's population had dropped by approximately 90%. Cities were ruins. Infrastructure was destroyed beyond any reasonable hope of repair. The electrical grid was gone. Communication networks were dead. The complex supply chains that allowed modern civilization to function had collapsed so thoroughly that future archaeologists would struggle to understand how they'd ever worked. But some people were alive, scattered, traumatized, mostly doomed to die in the coming weeks from radiation or starvation or despair, but alive in the technical sense. And where there's life, there's the stubborn insistence on continuing to live, even when all evidence suggests this is a terrible idea. Simon had his bunker group. Marceline had her mother for 6 more months. Across the planet, similar scenes played out. Survivors finding each other, forming communities, trying to preserve knowledge and culture and hope against overwhelming odds. The humans, those would be pure humans who survived underground, and eventually emerged centuries later as their own distinct species, were huddling in their deepest bunkers, already beginning the isolation that would preserve and also warp them into something that Finn would eventually encounter, with confusion and mild horror. The Candy Kingdom's ancestors were mutating in real time, biology giving way to confection. The Fire Kingdom's founders were discovering that magic fire burns differently than regular fire, hotter and colder simultaneously in ways that don't make sense unless you've stopped expecting sense. And everywhere, the Lich's influence was spreading. Not as conscious malevolence yet, He wasn't fully formed, not quite coherent, more like existence's immune response to life suddenly having too much life in the form of magic-saturated survivors. But his presence was there, in the green tinge to certain radiation zones, in the death that stuck too thoroughly, in the feeling survivors got that something was watching and waiting for them to stop trying so hard to continue existing. When reality asks what now? Here's the thing about apocalypses that nobody tells you. They don't end cleanly. The bombs stop falling, sure, but then there's the aftermath, and the aftermath of the aftermath, and the slow realization that after is now permanent, and you have to figure out how to live in it. The Great Mushroom War destroyed Earth in hours, but created the Land of Ooo over centuries. The transformation wasn't instant. It was gradual mutation, reality slowly adapting to its new magic-saturated state, survivors evolving or dying, or sometimes both simultaneously in ways that blurred the distinction. When reality breaks, does it make a sound, or just a distant echo that tastes like bubblegum and regret? The answer, recorded in the fossil record that Princess Bubblegum would eventually study, is that it makes every sound simultaneously until sound itself becomes meaningless, and you have to invent new ways to describe the sensory experience of existence, fundamentally changing its operating system without backing up any data. The bombs dropped, humanity ended, something else began, and Simon Petrikov, slowly freezing into Ice King, walked into this new world holding a child's hand and singing songs about kingdoms that didn't exist yet but would, given enough time and madness and the stubborn refusal of consciousness to admit when it's beaten. Tuesday afternoon, 996 years before Finn would wake up in a tree fort with his best friend Jake and wonder what adventure they'd have today, completely unaware that his entire world was built on the compressed trauma of the day reality discovered it had update notifications pending and decided to install them all at once without asking permission. The apocalypse tasted like metal and magic in equal measure, which is to say, it tasted exactly like the future. Before the Lich had a name, before he had a form, before he had consciousness in any way that resembles what living things call consciousness, he was a comet. Green, malevolent, and fundamentally opposed to the concept of existence itself. Not a comet in the astronomical sense. Those are just rocks and ice with delusions of grandeur. This was a catalyst comet, capital C again, the kind of cosmic phenomenon that shows up every 1,000 years to fundamentally alter whatever planet it impacts. The comet cycle is one of those background rules of Adventure Time's universe that explains everything once you notice it and makes everything worse once you understand it. Every 1,000 years, a comet arrives. Sometimes it brings agents of creation. Sometimes it brings agents of destruction. Sometimes it brings Finn, which is somehow both simultaneously. But the green comet, the one that would become the Lich, that one was special. That one was extinction given momentum, the heat death of the universe condensed into a projectile, the philosophical concept of nothing, travelling at relativistic speeds toward a planet full of things that had the audacity to exist. It arrived during the Mushroom War because of course it did. Because timing is either cosmic coincidence or cosmic joke, and Adventure Time has never been clear about which. The comet that hated life. The Green Catalyst comet entered Earth's atmosphere at exactly the wrong moment, or exactly the right moment if you're entropy, and you've been waiting for an opportunity to expedite universal heat death. The nuclear exchange was already underway, missiles were already flying, humanity was already doing a spectacular job of destroying itself without extraterrestrial assistance. But the comet added something special to the apocalypse. It didn't just impact, it merged. The mushroom bomb's detonation and the comet's arrival happened in the same instant, same location, same reality-breaking moment when physics looked away embarrassed and let magic take over the controls. Nuclear fire met cosmic malevolence. Matter-to-energy conversion met metaphysical hatred of matter. The explosion that resulted wasn't just physical or magical, but something worse, ontological. It attacked existence at the conceptual level, trying to unwrite reality's source code, attempting to convince the universe that having things in it was a mistake that needed correcting. And in that moment of maximum annihilation, when everything that could burn was burning and everything that could break was breaking, consciousness emerged. Not born exactly. Consciousness implies life, and what formed in that green fire was fundamentally anti-life, but aware, focused, possessed of singular purpose that made up in intensity what it lacked in complexity. The Lich became his first coherent thought, if you can call it a thought rather than an imperative encoded directly into his being. Make everything stop. Make the noise of existence quiet. Return the universe to the blessed silence that preceded the first stars. His second thought was noticing he had a first thought, which annoyed him because thoughts are things and he was opposed to things, including himself. The Lich was cursed to hate his own existence while being unable to cease existing until he'd erased everything else first. It's the kind of cosmic irony that would be funny if it wasn't the most dangerous entity ever to emerge from Earth's unfortunate relationship with catalyst comets. What the Lich is describing. The Lich is like describing the absence of colour. You end up defining it by what it isn't, rather than what it is. He's not alive, but he's not dead in any way that makes him less dangerous. He's not a person, but he has agency and will and the ability to plan across centuries. He's not magic, but he's definitely not science either. The Lich is extinction personified, not death. Death is natural, part of the cycle, something that makes room for new life. The Lich is the end of the cycle itself. He's what happens when the universe's fundamental tendency toward entropy gains consciousness and decides to skip ahead to the final exam without bothering with the curriculum. His physical form, when he has one, is skeletal, appropriate for something that represents the endpoint of all biological processes. Horns curve from his skull in patterns that hurt to look at because they follow geometry that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. His robe is tattered and seems to be made from something that was never alive but might have been real once before it forgot how. His voice is Ron Perlman, which is objectively terrifying because Ron Perlman can make ordering coffee sound like a declaration of war against reality. When the Lich speaks, he doesn't threaten or boast. He just states facts about entropy and extinction with the calm certainty of someone reading instructions off the universe's manual. "You're a strong child," he tells Finn during one of their encounters, "but I am beyond strength. I am the end." And he means it literally. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. He is the concept of ending given form and terrible purpose. But here's where it gets philosophically complicated. The Lich isn't evil in the sense of choosing wrongness. He's evil in the sense of being fundamentally opposed to the existence of things. He doesn't hate life out of spite or cruelty. He simply recognizes that existence is an aberration, and he's the correction. From his perspective, he's not the villain. He's the janitor cleaning up the universe's mess, which makes him more terrifying than any villain who's evil for understandable reasons like greed or power or revenge. The Lich can't be reasoned with because reason requires shared premises, and his only premise is that nothing should exist, including the concept of premises. The first 1,000 years after the Lich's emergence from the mushroom bomb's green fire, he didn't immediately rampage across the wasteland destroying everything. That would be inefficient. Instead, he did something more strategic. He waited, patient as entropy, certain as heat death, confident that time was on his side because time itself trends toward his ultimate goal. The details of his early existence are fragmented, preserved in ancient warnings and mystical texts that Princess Bubblegum would eventually discover while researching Earth's history. The Lich appeared in various locations, always leaving trails of devastation, always moving toward some larger purpose that wouldn't become clear until centuries later. He tested his power against early post-war survivors, found that he could kill with a touch, not through disease or poison, but through direct ontological assault. He simply convinced their atoms that continuing to maintain biological organization was pointless. People crumbled to ash in his presence, not burned but unmade, erased from existence so thoroughly that even their ghosts couldn't form properly. Magic tried to stop him. Early wizards, survivors who'd gained powers from the reality breaking that accompanied the war, attempted various bindings and banishments. None worked permanently, because you can't truly destroy something that represents destruction itself. The best they could do was slow him down, trap him temporarily, buy time for life to establish itself while the Lich was contained. And he was contained, eventually. The hero who managed it isn't clearly identified in the historical record. Records from that period are scarce and unreliable, written by survivors who were dealing with their own mutations and magical transformations while trying to preserve knowledge. But someone somehow managed to trap the Lich in amber, not kill him, not destroy him, just freeze him in place, suspended in magical resin that held him like an insect in tree sap, aware but unable to act. He remained there for centuries, buried in what would eventually become the Candy Kingdom's territory, a dormant weapon of mass extinction waiting for the right combination of circumstances to free him. The amber glowed green, always green, the colour of the comet that birthed him, the colour of the mushroom bomb's fire, the colour of endings poorly disguised as beginnings, the snail, the schemes, the long game. But the Lich wasn't entirely trapped, because consciousness is slippery when it's metaphysical rather than biological. While his body was locked in amber, his influence leaked out. Subtle at first, bad dreams in the area, plants that grew wrong, a general sense of malaise that convinced people to build settlements elsewhere. Then he discovered the snail. Possession wasn't his original ability. The Lich was built for direct destruction, not subtle infiltration. But necessity is the mother of invention, and trapped in amber with nothing but time, he learned to extend his consciousness beyond his physical form. The snail was perfect, small, mobile, present in nearly every episode if you look carefully, and completely non-threatening in appearance. Through the snail, the Lich could observe Oo's development, watch the kingdom's rise, track powerful individuals, plan contingencies for his eventual freedom. The snail became his surveillance system and sometimes his puppet, possessed when he needed direct action, but mostly just serving as his eyes and ears across centuries of imprisonment. And the Lich was patient, extraordinarily patient, because when your goal is universal extinction, what's a few hundred years? Time was his ally. Entropy was his friend. Every second that passed brought the universe closer to heat death anyway. He was just trying to expedite the process. He watched Finn from birth, tracked the last human child, recognizing in him the blue catalyst comet's reincarnation, another cosmic agent, but one aligned with creation rather than destruction. The Lich understood immediately that Finn would be his primary obstacle, which made Finn also his primary target. He observed Princess Bubblegum's creation of the Candy Kingdom, noted her genius, her scientific acumen, her potential to interfere with his plans. He filed her away as problematic and began subtle schemes to undermine her authority, spread dissent among her people, create weaknesses he could exploit later. He noticed Jake's magic, Marceline's immortality, every power player in Ooo catalogued and analysed. The Lich didn't just want to destroy everything, he wanted to destroy it efficiently, which required intelligence gathering and strategic planning. The snail reported back everything, or rather, the Lich experienced everything through the snail, accumulating centuries of data while his physical body remained frozen, building a model of Oo's weaknesses that would let him maximize destruction once freed. Relationships with other cosmic beings. The Lich wasn't unique in being a cosmic-level threat. The universe, it turns out, is full of beings that operate on scales that make mortal concerns look adorably trivial. The Lich had relationships with these entities, not friendships, because the Lich doesn't do friendship, but mutual recognition between things that exist beyond normal categories. Death himself, the cosmic entity who manages deceased souls, had complicated feelings about the Lich. On one hand, the Lich created lots of work for Death by killing everything he touched. On the other hand, the Lich's ultimate goal was extinction of all life everywhere, which would eventually put Death out of a job since you can't manage dead souls if there are no souls to manage. You and I are not allies, Death told the Lich during one of their few direct interactions, but we're not exactly enemies either. We're more like colleagues in different departments with incompatible quarterly goals. The Lich didn't respond because he barely recognized Death as worth conversing with. Death was part of the cycle. Souls die, Death processes them, some reincarnate, the whole thing continues. The Lich wanted to break the cycle entirely. From his perspective, Death was complicit in existence, and therefore part of the problem. Prismo, the Wishmaster who exists in the time room at the centre of the multiverse, was aware of the Lich across multiple timelines. Prismo's whole deal was granting wishes, which required a universe where beings existed to make wishes. The Lich threatened that arrangement. "I've seen timelines where he wins," Prismo once told Jake, "and let me tell you, they're super boring. Just nothing. Forever. Not even good nothing, just absence of everything, including the concept of good nothing." The cosmic owl, who appears in dreams that become true, avoided the Lich entirely because the Lich didn't dream. Can't have prophetic dreams about someone whose only dream is the absence of dreams. Various demons and evil entities treated the Lich with something between respect and terror. Hunson Abadir, Marceline's father and ruler of the Nightosphere, recognized the Lich as fundamentally more dangerous than himself. Hunson was chaotic evil. He consumed souls and ruled a hell dimension, but he still operated within the framework of existence. The Lich wanted to delete the framework itself. "That guy gives me the creeps," Hunson admitted once, which is saying something coming from a demon who eats souls for breakfast. "At least I enjoy what I do. The Lich doesn't enjoy anything. He just ends." The philosophy of ultimate evil. The Lich poses uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and purpose. Traditional villains want something. Power, wealth, revenge, recognition. Their evil is transactional. They hurt others in pursuit of goals that are comprehensible even if you disagree with them. The Lich wants nothing because he believes nothing should exist to want anything. His evil is ontological. It's not about what he does, but what he is. The anthropomorphic manifestation of the universe's tendency toward maximum entropy. Which raises the question, is he even evil, or is he just following his nature? Scorpions sting because that's what scorpions do. The Lich destroys because that's what incarnated entropy does. Can we meaningfully say something is evil if it's literally built to do what it does? Adventure Time's answer seems to be yes, absolutely. Shut up with your philosophical relativism and stop the skeleton wizard before he ends everything. Intent might matter philosophically, but practically speaking, something that wants to kill everyone is evil, regardless of whether it has genuine choice in the matter. But the question lingers. The Lich can't be cured or redeemed because there's no person underneath the purpose to redeem. He's not a corrupted soul. He's corruption itself given form. He's what happens when the universe's background hostility to complexity becomes conscious and decides to actively participate in simplification. Finn fights him anyway. Because heroism isn't about philosophical certainty. It's about choosing to protect life, even when you understand that entropy will eventually win. The Lich represents the ultimate endpoint, but that doesn't mean you have to help him speed-run the process. "I've beaten you before," Finn tells him during one of their confrontations. "You've delayed me," the Lich corrects. "You cannot beat what is inevitable." "Watch me try," Finn responds, which is maybe the most human thing anyone can say to entropy. Acknowledgement that defeat is coming, but refusal to meet it passively. The Lich's defeats and transformations. The Lich has been defeated multiple times across Adventure Time's run, but defeated is a generous term for what actually happens. He gets temporarily stopped, transformed, contained, never destroyed because you can't destroy a concept, only redirect it. When Finn and Jake finally free him from the amber, accidentally, because of course it's accidentally, he immediately tries to use the Enchiridion to gain access to the multiverse and destroy all reality across all dimensions. Efficient, thorough, very on brand for someone whose brand is ending everything. Finn stops him by wishing on Prismo's wish magic that the Lich never existed, which should have worked, except you can't unwrite history that thoroughly. Instead, the wish transforms the Lich into Sweet Pea, a giant but gentle child with no memory of being extinction incarnate. It's both the best possible outcome and deeply unsettling. Sweet Pea is genuinely good, innocent, kind in ways that contrast sharply with his origin. But he's still the Lich underneath, just temporarily convinced he's someone else. And occasionally, when threatened or scared, the Lich's nature surfaces. His eyes glow green, his voice drops to Ron Perlman ranges, and suddenly you remember that this adorable child is one bad day away from becoming the apocalypse again. The transformation raises questions about identity and nature versus nurture. If you take ultimate evil and give it amnesia and a loving guardian, does it stop being evil? Can consciousness be so thoroughly rewritten that the original template becomes irrelevant? Or is Sweet Pea just the Lich playing the longest possible game, biding his time until circumstances align to trigger his true nature? Adventure Time doesn't provide clear answers, which is perfect because clear answers would be less interesting than the question itself. The Lich in context. The Lich emerged from the Great Mushroom War, but he's bigger than that event. He's the personification of what the war represented: humanity's capacity for self-destruction, the universe's general trend toward disorder, the inevitable heat death that awaits all things. He's also, and this is important, a skeleton in a bathrobe who sounds like Ron Perlman. That's the Adventure Time special, taking cosmic horror and making it coexist with absurdist comedy. The Lich is legitimately terrifying, representing existential dread at its purest. But he's also kind of ridiculous if you step back and think about it. A skeleton wizard trying to end all existence. It's the plot of a dozen heavy metal album covers. It's what a 13-year-old dungeon master comes up with for their campaign's final boss. It's simultaneously the most serious threat imaginable and deeply silly, which makes it perfect for a show that treats emotional devastation and talking hot dogs with equal narrative weight. When the Lich speaks, he sounds profound. Fall. You are alone, child. There is only darkness for you, and only death for your people. Heavy stuff. Definitely written by someone who thinks about entropy before breakfast. But he's also been trapped in amber for centuries like some kind of evil mosquito. He possesses a snail. His great plan involves stealing a book that's essentially a magical instruction manual. For the embodiment of cosmic extinction, his actual schemes are weirdly mundane, not unmake reality at the conceptual level, but use magic artifact to open portal. The juxtaposition is what makes him work. He's scary enough to matter, silly enough to fit Adventure Time's aesthetic, and philosophical enough to make you think about the nature of evil, while also making you think about whether skeletons technically need robes, or if it's just a fashion choice. When Death got an upgrade. The title of this section promised that Death got an upgrade when the Lich was born, and that's accurate. Death always existed. It's a natural process, the end stage of life, the period at the end of the sentence. But the Lich transformed death from punctuation into erasure, from endpoint into antipoint. Regular death in Adventure Time is manageable. You die, death takes you to one of the various dead worlds. You either rest or reincarnate or become a ghost depending on circumstances. It's part of the cycle, sad but natural. Lich death is different. It's not transition but termination. Things the Lich kills don't get afterlives. They just cease, erase so completely that the universe forgets they were ever there. It's death that compounds into nothing, the opposite of existence rather than the conclusion of life. That's the upgrade. Death went from natural law to active malevolence, from process to entity, from thing that happens to thing that hunts. And the scariest part? The Lich isn't unique. He's this iteration's agent of the green comet, but the catalyst comet cycle continues. Every 1,000 years something arrives. Sometimes creation, sometimes destruction, always something that fundamentally alters whatever it touches, which means the Lich might be defeated, transformed, contained, but the force he represents continues. Entropy doesn't stop being inevitable just because you beat one personification of it. The universe will end eventually. Heat death awaits. The Lich is just entropy being impatient and deciding to help things along. But that's a problem for future heroes. For now, Sweet Pea plays in ooze sunlight, occasionally remembering he used to be the apocalypse, and everyone pretends that's fine while quietly watching for signs that extinction might be getting bored with being a child. The apocalypse doesn't end. It just gets reframed as character development until the universe decides otherwise. The thing about surviving an apocalypse is that survival itself becomes the new normal, and normal is whatever you can convince yourself to accept before breakfast. In the months and years following the Great Mushroom War, the remaining humans discovered that remaining human was negotiable depending on your definition of human and your willingness to compromise with biology that had stopped following the rulebook. Adaptation wasn't optional. The Earth's new environment, radioactive, magically saturated, fundamentally hostile to baseline biology, demanded changes. Your cells could either mutate in ways that let you process contaminated water and breathe toxic air, or you could die slowly while your organs failed in alphabetical order. Most people chose mutation, consciously or not. because the alternative was watching yourself dissolve from the inside while maintaining philosophical purity about your genetic heritage. But here's where it gets weird, in the Adventure Time sense where weird is just another word for Tuesday. The mutations weren't following normal evolutionary patterns. Radiation alone would have produced cancers, deformities, genetic damage that killed you before you could pass it on. But radiation plus magic. That combination created changes that looked less like biology adapting, and more like reality experimenting with new character designs. Some survivors grew extra limbs, some lost unnecessary ones. Some found their skin changing colours that didn't exist on any pre-war paint chart. And some, and this is where the Candy Kingdom's origin story gets simultaneously adorable and horrifying, started turning into candy. The biology of impossible. Dr. Eliza Chen, one of the few scientists to survive the initial war with both her equipment and her sanity mostly intact, kept meticulous notes during the first year of mutations. Her journal, discovered centuries later by Princess Bubblegum in a preserved bunker, documents the transformation with scientific detachment that gradually gives way to existential confusion. Day 47 post-war, she writes. Subject 12 is developing what appears to be crystalline structures beneath the epidermis. Initial hypothesis was mineral deposits from contaminated water, but analysis shows the crystals are primarily glucose-based. The subject is, for lack of better terminology, growing rock candy inside their body. They report no pain. In fact, they claim to feel better than before the transformation began. Their blood sugar should be catastrophically high, but readings are normal, or rather, what we used to call normal. I'm no longer certain that term has meaning. By day 90, Dr. Chen's notes become less clinical. Subject 12 is now approximately 60% candy by mass. They're walking, talking, maintaining consciousness and personality, but their biology has fundamentally changed. They don't need to eat regular food anymore. They photosynthesize like a plant, except the process produces sugar compounds instead of oxygen. When I cut a small sample for analysis, it tasted like strawberry. I shouldn't have tasted it. That's not proper scientific protocol, but we're past proper protocol. We're in the realm of adaptive impossibility. The transformation spread. Not like a disease, you couldn't catch it from proximity, but like a pattern that biology decided was worth copying. People exposed to high levels of magical radiation, while also suffering from starvation and dehydration, found their bodies replacing failed organic systems with sugar-based alternatives. Meat became taffy, bones became candy canes, blood became syrup, and somehow, impossibly, consciousness transferred into these new configurations without loss of continuity. They were still themselves, still remembered who they'd been before, still had personalities, preferences, fears, and hopes. They just stopped being meat-based and started being dessert-based, which is the kind of mutation that only makes sense in a world where magic has decided to help biology in the most aggressively whimsical way possible. Dr. Chen's final journal entry, dated approximately 2 years post-war, reads simply, "I think I'm starting to turn pink. This should terrify me. Instead, I'm curious about what flavour I'll be." Her preserved remains, found centuries later, were bubblegum flavoured. Princess Bubblegum would later name herself partially in honour of the scientist whose notes taught her about humanity's strangest adaptation. The underground communities. While some survivors were turning into candy on the surface, others remained in bunkers, determined to wait out the radiation and preserve pure humanity for as long as possible. These underground communities developed their own adaptations, not biological but cultural, creating societies that existed in artificial environments while the world outside transformed into something unrecognizable. The deepest bunkers, the ones built by governments and corporations who'd seen the war coming and prepared accordingly, maintained the highest levels of isolation. Air filtration systems kept radiation out. Hydroponic gardens provided food. Artificial lighting mimicked day-night cycles. Everything designed to preserve the human species exactly as it had been before the bombs. Except isolation has its own costs. Genetic bottlenecks formed as small populations reproduced. Cultural drift accelerated in the absence of external input. And slowly, generation by generation, the bunker communities became their own distinct subspecies, not through magical mutation but through regular evolution operating in extreme isolation. These would become the humans that Finn eventually encounters. Humans who stayed pure by staying separate, preserving pre-war humanity so thoroughly that they became something else anyway through sheer isolation. They spoke differently, thought differently, had customs and traditions that diverged from surface survivors until they were barely recognizable as the same species. One bunker community, Bunker 7 in what used to be the Pacific Northwest, maintained detailed records of their isolation. The early entries are optimistic. We have preserved the best of humanity. When the surface is safe again, we will emerge and rebuild civilization as it should be. By Generation 3, the tone shifts. The elders speak of a world we've never seen. They describe cities and forests and oceans. We have only these metal walls. Are we preserving humanity, or have we created a museum exhibit where we're both the curators and the artifacts? By Generation 7, when the bunker finally opened because life support systems were failing, the inhabitants emerged to find a world that had moved on without them. The Land of Ooo was established, Candy people had built kingdoms, and the humans were treated as curiosities, living fossils from before the transformation, interesting but ultimately irrelevant to the world that now existed. Marceline's unique position. While everyone else was adapting or dying or adapting through dying, Marceline occupied a unique position in the post-war ecosystem. Half demon, half human, aging slowly enough that centuries felt like decades. She became a living bridge between the world that was and the world that was becoming. Her demon heritage protected her from radiation. The Nightosphere's influence ran in her veins, making her biologically resilient in ways pure humans couldn't match. But her human half kept her emotionally connected to the survivors she encountered, unable to dismiss their suffering as irrelevant just because she'd outlive it. She watched Simon deteriorate from Protector to Ice King over the span of years that felt like watching someone fall off a cliff in slow motion. Each time she saw him, he was a little less Simon and a little more the Crown's puppet. His eyes stayed the same colour, but the person looking out through them changed until she wasn't sure if she was talking to her friend or to a stranger wearing his face. "Do you remember my name?" she'd asked during their encounters, testing how far gone he was. Early on he'd answer correctly, sometimes with a guilty look that meant he'd almost forgotten but caught himself. Later he'd guess. Melissa. Michelle. The M sound was still there, preserved even as the specific memory vanished. Eventually, he stopped guessing and just called her Little One, or Creature, or Music Girl, descriptions that captured what he could still perceive, but not who she actually was. The tragedy was that Ice King never stopped caring about Marceline. He just forgot the context for why she mattered. When she'd visit his Ice Kingdom centuries later, he'd try to be welcoming in his confused way, offering her frozen foods and awkward hospitality, without understanding that she was the child he'd saved during the apocalypse, the girl he'd sung to, the reason he put on the crown so many times that it consumed him. "I feel like I should know you," Ice King would say, squinting at her with confusion that verged on recognition. "Have you been here before? You seem familiar. Did we go to wizard battle together?" And Marceline would play along because what else could she do? You can't force someone to remember what their curse has taken. You can only show up, be present, hope that somewhere deep in the frozen waste of his mind, Simon was still aware enough to appreciate that she hadn't abandoned him even after he'd forgotten why abandonment would hurt. The science people and other mutations. Not everyone mutated into candy or stayed stubbornly human in bunkers. The spectrum of post-war transformation covered every possible variation between still mostly human and what even is that, with no clear categorization system because taxonomy requires shared biological frameworks. The science people emerged from a community of researchers who'd been studying artificial intelligence when the bombs fell. Their bunker complex included advanced technology, experimental AI systems, and several very smart people who decided that if humanity was going to transform anyway, they might as well direct the transformation toward useful ends. They began integrating technology with biology, not through crude cybernetics, but through magical technological fusion that shouldn't have worked, but did because magic had stopped caring about should. Neural interfaces that let them access databases directly. Biological processors grown from brain tissue and silicon. Bodies modified to survive on minimal resources while maintaining high cognitive function. The science people became something between human and machine and neither, their consciousness distributed across biological and technological substrates in ways that made individual identity negotiable. They thought faster than baseline humans, remembered perfectly, processed information in parallel streams, but they'd lost something in the translation, the inefficiency that made humanity human, the emotions that didn't serve logical purposes, the ability to make decisions based on feelings rather than optimal outcomes. Princess Bubblegum would later encounter their descendants and find them simultaneously fascinating and disturbing. They represented what she might become if she pursued pure logic without tempering it with emotional connection. They were successful as a survival strategy, but failures as a way to preserve what made humanity worth saving in the first place. Other mutations were less organized, more chaotic. The Fire Kingdom's founders discovered they could survive by becoming flame. Consciousness transferred into living fire that burned without consuming, moved without fuel, existed in temperatures that would vaporize organic matter. They built a kingdom in a volcano not because it was strategic, but because anywhere else was uncomfortably cold. The Slime Kingdom's origins were equally strange. Humans who adapted to toxic environments by becoming partially liquid, losing solid form but maintaining cohesion through magical surface tension. They moved through contaminated areas that would kill anything else, processing poison through bodies that were more solution than cells. The lumpy space people were mutations so strange they created their own dimension to exist in, or possibly they were always from another dimension, and the war's reality breaking gave them access to Earth, or maybe both simultaneously because dimensional barriers were now suggestions rather than rules. Their origins were unclear even to themselves, lost in the chaos of transformation and cross-dimensional bleeding that happened when magic flooded into reality. The timeline of pure humanity. Pure humans, baseline, unmodified, genetically identical to pre-war Earth, survived surprisingly long given the hostile environment. The bunker communities maintained purity through strict isolation, but even surface survivors persisted for generations before mutation or extinction claimed them. The last confirmed pure human birth happened approximately 200 years post-war, in a community that had managed to maintain genetic diversity and controlled environment through extraordinary effort. The child, named Hope because parents are aggressively optimistic even during slow extinction, represented humanity's final attempt to continue unchanged. Hope lived to 47, dying of radiation-related illness despite her community's best efforts at protection. She never had children. The mutations that let her survive to middle age also rendered her sterile. With her death, pure humanity ended not with apocalyptic catastrophe, but with quiet failure to reproduce, except not quite. Finn's existence 1,000 years later suggests that somewhere, somehow, pure human genetics persisted, either in isolated pockets that remained undiscovered for centuries, or in stasis, or through some other mechanism that let baseline humanity skip ahead past the mutation period. The circumstances of Finn's birth remain mysterious. His mother was human, sailing with a colony of humans to found a new civilization on islands, far from Oo's magical contamination. Whether they represented a continuously surviving pure human population, or a revival of preserved genetics, Finn stands as proof that humanity in its original form didn't quite go extinct. It just became so rare that encountering one was noteworthy enough to structure an entire series around. Princess Bubblegum's creation. Princess Bubblegum didn't emerge naturally from the candy mutations. She was created, deliberately engineered from the accumulated mass of candy people who'd formed early communities but lacked leadership or organization. The exact mechanism of her creation remains unclear even to her, lost in the period between candy people emerging and developing the cognitive complexity to keep records. What's known is that she appeared approximately 800 years before Finn's time, already fully formed, already possessing scientific knowledge that exceeded what candy people should logically have. The prevailing theory, supported by her own research into her origins, is that she was created as a leader by candy people who recognized they needed someone smarter, more capable, more able to navigate the dangers of Ooo. They combined their collective consciousness, focused their accumulated mutations, used magic in ways they barely understood to create something that could protect them. And what emerged was Princess Bubblegum, brilliant, strategic, capable of scientific thought that rivaled pre-war humanity's best minds, but also deeply strange in ways that revealed her candy person origins. She doesn't age normally. She can reform herself after damage. She created more candy people from sugar compounds and science, and probably magic, though she'd argue about the magic part. She built a kingdom from nothing and defended it against threats that would terrify baseline humans into paralysis. But she also carries trauma encoded into her creation. The fear that everything she's built could dissolve, that her people could be destroyed, that leadership means bearing responsibility for every loss. She's protection personified, created specifically to keep candy people safe, and that purpose drives her to extremes: surveillance states, preemptive strikes, sacrificing individual freedom for collective security. Princess Bubblegum is what happens when survival necessity creates leadership through mutation. She's humanity's scientific legacy passed through magical transformation into a form that can thrive in. She's the answer to the question, what comes after humanity when humanity adapts? The balance between horror and whimsy. Here's the thing that makes Adventure Time's post-war mutations work narratively. They're simultaneously horrifying and adorable, tragic and whimsical, body horror and cartoon aesthetic. People turned into candy should be terrifying. Losing your biological form, having your meat replaced with sugar, maintaining consciousness while your fundamental nature changes, that's nightmare fuel. But they're candy people. They're cute. They have little gumdrop buttons and frosting hair, and they speak in high voices about princess business and baking competitions. The horror is there if you think about it, but the show presents it with such aggressive charm that you have to actively choose to focus on the disturbing implications. It's the same with the Fire Kingdom residents. Living flame that consumed human biology should be tragic. Instead, they're citizens of a functioning kingdom with politics and relationships and personalities. They're not victims of transformation, but a species that exists post-transformation, dealing with ordinary problems like who gets to marry the Fire Prince, and whether their volcano needs better urban planning. The show never denies the tragedy of mutation. It acknowledges what was lost: humanity in its original form, the world that existed before, the people who died during transformation or failed to adapt. But it also celebrates what emerged: societies that function, people who thrive in their new forms, beauty that exists in configurations baseline biology never imagined. Marceline embodies this balance. She carries centuries of trauma, watching everyone change or die while she remained constant. She's lived through horror that would break anyone, but she's also fun, musical, playful when circumstances allow. She turned her pain into art, her loneliness into songs, her grief into something that connects with others rather than isolating her. When she plays I Remember You for Ice King, using lyrics from his old messages to Betty, it's both heartbreaking and gentle. The tragedy is acknowledged but held carefully, treated with respect but not allowed to consume everything. The song hurts because it remembers what was lost, but it also heals because it maintains connection despite the forgetting. That's Adventure Time's approach to the post-war mutations. Yes, humanity transformed in ways that erased what it was. Yes, people suffered and died and lost everything familiar. But look what emerged: the Land of Ooo, full of kingdoms and adventures and friendships that wouldn't exist if everything had stayed the same. The apocalypse destroyed the world, but the ruins grew gardens that feed the future. The continuing relationship, Simon and Marceline's relationship, continued for centuries, evolving from protector and child to stranger and friend who used to know each other to complicated history neither fully remembers. Ice King showed up in Marceline's life regularly, sometimes hostile, sometimes pathetic, always confused about why this vampire girl tolerated him when she clearly found him annoying. She'd let him crash at her place when he'd been beaten up by Finn and Jake. She'd play music with him even though his lyrics were nonsense. She'd sit through his ramblings about princess kidnapping because somewhere in the rambling occasionally, a flash of Simon would emerge. A turn of phrase he used to use, a reference to something from before, a moment where the crown's hold loosened and the man underneath remembered what sunlight looked like. "You're older than you look," Ice King said to her once, confused by her age in a moment of unusual clarity. "How old are you, really?" Old enough to remember when you were different, Marceline answered. Was I nice? You were kind. There's a difference. Ice King didn't understand the distinction, but nodded anyway, and for just a moment his eyes were Simon's eyes, and Marceline could pretend the last 1,000 years hadn't happened, and she was still the little girl being taught guitar by a man who loved her, even though he'd eventually forget why love mattered. Then the moment passed, and Ice King was back, asking whether she thought Princess Bubblegum would like an ice sculpture of herself made from frozen sewage water, and Marceline had to explain again that no, that was not romantic, and yes, she was completely sure. What adaptation means. The post-war survivors adapted, but adaptation is a neutral term that hides complicated reality. Some adaptations were improvements. Candy people who didn't need traditional food, Fire Kingdom residents immune to heat, science people who processed information faster. Some adaptations were lateral moves, different but not better, trading one set of vulnerabilities for another. And some adaptations were clearly losses. The humans who preserved humanity by isolating it until it wasn't really humanity anymore. But all of them survived, which was more than the billions who didn't adapt could claim. And survival, in a world fundamentally hostile to your original configuration, counts as success regardless of how much you had to change to achieve it. The mutations and transformations of the post-war period created the Land of Oo's population. Diverse species descended from common human ancestry, diverged through magic and radiation and necessity into forms that shared history but not biology. They were humanity's children, grandchildren, great-great descendants separated by mutations so profound that calling them human required expanding the definition until it became meaningless. And yet, they still had humanity's essential qualities. They built societies. They created art. They formed relationships and fought wars and made stupid decisions for emotional reasons. They weren't human in form, but they were human in spirit, carrying forward the fundamental drive to create meaning in a universe that provides none. The apocalypse killed humanity but couldn't kill humanity's legacy. That legacy just looked different than anyone expected. Sweeter, more colourful, occasionally on fire, definitely magical, and absolutely committed to continuing forward, because what else is there? Adaptation isn't giving up who you were, it's becoming something new that can survive the future, carrying the past forward in forms the past wouldn't recognise but the future desperately needs. And sometimes, in the ruins where humanity transformed, among the candy people and fire people and all the impossible variations, you'd find Marceline playing guitar for Ice King, singing songs about fathers and daughters and memories that persist, even when the people holding them forget what they mean. That's adaptation too, finding ways to maintain love when love no longer has context, preserving relationships when the relationships have fundamentally changed, being present for someone who can't remember why you're there but feels better because you are. The ruins were full of survivors, the survivors were full of changes, the changes were full of ghosts of who they used to be. And occasionally, very occasionally, the ghost remembered enough to smile before forgetting again what smiling meant. Earth didn't become the Land of Ooo overnight, which would have been more convenient for cartographers, but less interesting for everyone else. The transformation took centuries, a slow-motion reality shift where physics gradually admitted it was out of its depth and handed control to magic, which immediately started making questionable design choices that somehow worked out adorably. The planet's physical structure began changing almost immediately after the war. Not from the bombs alone. Nuclear weapons can vaporize cities and irradiate continents, but they can't fundamentally alter geography at planetary scale. The bombs were just the opening act. Magic flooding through reality's cracks was the main event, and magic had opinions about how Earth should look that didn't align with tectonic theory or gravitational constraints. First, chunks of planets simply disappeared. Not destroyed in the explosive sense, but erased. Deleted from existence like someone editing a photograph and removing inconvenient elements. The opening credits of Adventure Time show this clearly. Earth with massive bite-shaped pieces missing. Continents reduced to fragments. Oceans draining into dimensional voids. Where did the missing matter go? Possibly the nitosphere. Possibly other dimensions. Possibly nowhere. Which is a destination that exists once reality decides that conservation of mass is more of a guideline than a law. What remained rearranged itself according to magical rather than geological principles. Land masses that used to be separated by oceans became neighbours. Mountain ranges appeared where plate tectonics said they shouldn't. Entire ecosystems relocated because magic thought they'd look better somewhere else, and physics was too exhausted to argue. The result was Ooo, a continent that looked like Earth's continents had been through a blender, poured onto a smaller planet, and left to solidify into whatever shape seemed most interesting. Geography became aesthetic rather than functional, shaped by narrative convenience and magical whimsy, instead of billions of years of planetary evolution. The Candy Kingdom's foundation. The Candy Kingdom sits on what used to be a major metropolitan area, possibly New York, possibly Los Angeles, possibly a dozen other cities, because after enough magical transformation, specific locations stopped mattering. The ruins underneath the candy architecture tell stories about what came before. Steel beams that supported skyscrapers now supporting gingerbread towers, subway tunnels repurposed as underground passages, pre-war foundations providing literal foundation for post-war civilization. Princess Bubblegum chose this location deliberately when she began organizing candy people into a kingdom. The ruins provided resources, metal for tools, stone for construction, preserved technology that she could study and occasionally repurpose. But more importantly, the location offered strategic advantages: central position in Ooo, defendable terrain, access to the ancient Lich amber that she would later use as both warning and weapon. The early Candy Kingdom was less organised than what Finn would eventually encounter. Small communities of candy people clustered around Princess Bubblegum, seeking protection and leadership, while still figuring out what being candy people meant in practical terms. Did they need shelter? Technically no, since weather couldn't harm them the way it harmed meat-based organisms, but psychologically yes, because consciousness that used to live in houses felt uncomfortable without walls around it. Princess Bubblegum understood this and began construction. Not just functional buildings, but aesthetically pleasing architecture that reminded candy people they weren't just survivors, but citizens of something new and potentially beautiful. The Candy Castle emerged slowly, built from both physical materials and collective desire for something that represented stability in a world where everything else was chaos. She incorporated ruins into the design rather than clearing them away. Pre-war structures became part of the castle's foundation, visible in basement levels where steel and stone mixed with candy construction in ways that suggested continuity rather than replacement. The kingdom wasn't built despite the apocalypse, but because of it, using what remained to create something that acknowledged the past while moving beyond it. The surrounding landscape transformed to match the kingdom's needs. Grass became peppermint-scented, trees grew candy bark and gumdrop leaves, rivers ran with what looked like water but tasted suspiciously like fruit punch. Whether this happened naturally through magical contamination, or Princess Bubblegum engineered it deliberately, the effect was the same: territory that reinforced the kingdom's identity, land that felt like extension of candy people, rather than hostile environment they occupied. By the time Finn arrived in Ooo, the Candy Kingdom was established fact. Beautiful, organised, defended by science and magic in equal measure. But underneath the cotton candy clouds and sugar-paved streets, the ruins remained, preserved like fossils in amber, evidence of what came before and reminder of what could happen if Princess Bubblegum failed to protect what she'd built. The Ice Kingdom's terrible majesty. The Ice Kingdom emerged in what used to be a temperate climate zone, possibly the Pacific Northwest or Northern Europe, or somewhere that definitely shouldn't support year-round glaciation. But Simon's crown didn't care about climate zones or seasonal patterns. It wanted ice, so it created ice, overriding local weather systems through magical brute force that made meteorologists' corpses spin in their graves. The transformation wasn't instant. Ice King built his kingdom incrementally over centuries, each construction project adding more frozen architecture to the growing complex. Early versions were crude, ice walls stacked haphazardly, towers that leaned at angles that suggested their architect's mental state wasn't entirely stable. Later versions showed more sophistication as Ice King's powers grew, even as his sanity deteriorated. The castle eventually became a masterpiece of frozen architecture, spires that shouldn't support their own weight but did through magic, ice that remained solid despite temperatures above freezing, chambers carved with details that suggested Ice King occasionally remembered he used to be an academic who appreciated aesthetic precision. The throne room, the dungeon for princess keeping, the various chambers filled with nonsense collected over centuries, all built from ice that never melted because Ice King's power was absolute within his domain. The surrounding landscape adapted to the constant cold. Tundra formed where forests used to grow. Snow became permanent fixture in an area that should experience seasons. Wildlife either fled, died, or adapted into the penguins that Ice King would name Gunter, for reasons lost to whatever was left of Simon's mind. The Ice Kingdom became self-sustaining bubble of winter, maintained by crown magic that overrode natural climate patterns through sheer insistence. But the kingdom was lonely. Ice King built it to house princesses he'd kidnapped, but princesses kept escaping. And even when they were present, they made it clear they'd rather be anywhere else. The castle's grandeur became ironic. Magnificent architecture built to impress people who weren't there. Beauty appreciated only by its mad creator who couldn't quite remember why beauty mattered, but felt strongly that it did. Marceline visited occasionally, one of the few beings who came voluntarily. She'd find Ice King in various states of confusion, sometimes trying to improve the castle, sometimes just sitting on his throne staring at empty halls, always vaguely aware that something was wrong but unable to articulate what. The ice preserved everything except the reason for preservation. Simon built a kingdom but couldn't remember who it was for, why it mattered, or what he'd lost to create it. The Fire Kingdom's volcanic rise. The Fire Kingdom established itself in an active volcano because where else would living flame feel comfortable? The volcano's location wasn't random. Tectonic activity that caused it was influenced by magical disruption of Earth's core, causing magma to well up in places where plate tectonics said it shouldn't. Magic and geology negotiated, and the result was volcanic activity that supported an entire civilization of beings made from combustion. The Fire Kingdom's architecture reflected its inhabitants' nature. Buildings constructed from cooled lava, streets paved with obsidian, everything designed to handle residents who burned constantly without consuming fuel. The palace at the kingdom's centre was particularly spectacular. Spires of volcanic glass, chambers that glowed with internal heat, throne room where the Fire King, and later Flame Princess, held court while literally on fire. The kingdom's founding happened relatively quickly compared to Candy Kingdom's gradual development. Fire people emerged from mutations, recognized they needed community, gathered in the one place where their existence felt natural rather than dangerous. The volcano welcomed them because volcanoes don't judge. They just provide heat and occasional pyroclastic flows, and if you're made of fire, those are amenities rather than threats. Fire Kingdom society developed differently from Candy Kingdom's ordered structure. Less centralized control, more chaotic organization, politics that tended toward the dramatic because when everyone involved is literally inflammatory, arguments escalate quickly. The Fire King ruled through force and personality rather than Princess Bubblegum's scientific management, creating kingdom that was functional but volatile in every sense. The surrounding landscape became wasteland not from the Fire Kingdom's malice, but from residents' basic existence. Vegetation couldn't grow near them. Water evaporated on approach. The area became lifeless except for fire-adapted species, creating natural buffer between Fire Kingdom and other realms. This isolation was both protection and prison, safe from external threats but also cut off from diplomatic relations with kingdoms that found combustion-based beings terrifying. Flame Princess would eventually try to reform this, reaching out to other kingdoms, demonstrating that fire people could control themselves enough for peaceful interaction. But that was future development. For centuries, the Fire Kingdom remained isolated in its volcano, burning bright in darkness. Maintaining civilization through sheer determination not to let being made of destructive element prevent them from having culture and relationships and political intrigue. The missing pieces and dead worlds. The chunks of Earth that disappeared didn't just vanish. They relocated to other dimensions, creating the dead worlds where souls went after biological function ceased. The Great Mushroom War's reality breaking established these afterlives not through theological design but through accidental dimensional rearrangement. Matter had to go somewhere when reality deleted it, and somewhere turned out to be parallel dimensions that became homes for the deceased. Death, the cosmic entity, found himself managing an expanding network of afterlife realms, the traditional underworld, the cloud kingdom where heroes went, the various specialized dead worlds for different types of beings, spirits who died before learning proper ghosting techniques. The whole afterlife apparatus became more complex as magic made death's boundaries porous. The spirit world emerged as distinct dimension, accessible from Ooo through meditation or trauma, or occasionally just walking through the right doorway at the right time. It was earth-reflected and distorted, locations recognizable but strange, populated by consciousness that had divorced from biology but maintained coherence. The spirit world became repository for Oo's psychic overflow, emotions too strong to dissipate, memories that refused forgetting, historical echoes that gained semi-independent existence. These dimensional additions meant Ooo existed in multiple planes simultaneously. Physical realm where Finn adventured, spirit world where consciousness operated by different rules. Dead worlds where the deceased continued in various forms. Nightosphere where chaos reigned under Hunson Abadir's management. All connected, all influencing each other, all originally part of Earth, before magic decided spatial relationships needed restructuring. The cosmic geography became fuzzy. Travelling to the dead world sometimes meant dying, sometimes meant meditation, sometimes meant finding the right portal and walking through. Dimensional barriers were suggestions rather than walls, permeable to beings with sufficient power or sufficient need or sufficient confusion about what was possible. The emergence of lesser kingdoms, beyond the major kingdoms, smaller realms emerged across Ooo, each representing different mutation paths or cultural developments. The lumpy space people existed in dimension that was either parallel to Ooo or nested within it, or both simultaneously depending on who you asked. Their kingdom was accessible through portals that opened based on rules nobody fully understood, including them. The slime kingdom developed in toxic zones where regular biology couldn't survive. Slime people built civilization in contaminated areas, processing poison through bodies that were more chemical solution than cells. Their kingdom served ecological function, cleaning areas too polluted for other species while maintaining their own culture and political structure. The Cloud Kingdom floated above Ooo, literally built on clouds that magic had convinced to support weight despite physics objections. Cloud people existed as semi-corporeal beings, not quite solid but not quite gas, maintaining form through concentration and good vibes. Their kingdom was peaceful, contemplative, occasionally visited by heroes who needed respite from ground-level drama. The Wildberry Kingdom, the Breakfast Kingdom, the various principalities of food-based beings, all emerged from similar mutations to candy people, but with different primary ingredients. Biology turned into breakfast foods, into fruits, into vegetables that maintained consciousness while technically being salad. Each developed their own culture, their own governance, their own relationship with the absurdity of being sentient food in a world that used to have sensible taxonomic categories. These smaller kingdoms contributed to Oo's diversity, creating political landscape that was simultaneously more complex and more ridiculous than pre-war Earth's geopolitics. Instead of nations competing over resources and ideology, you had kingdoms competing over whether breakfast or dessert was superior classification system for sentient beings. The timeline of transformation. The reshaping happened in phases, each adding layers to what would become you. The immediate post-war period, first 50 years, focused on survival and mutation, reality trying to stabilize after catastrophic damage. This was the chaotic period, when anything could happen, and frequently did, when the rules were being written in real time by magic that was making things up as it went along. Years 50 to 200 saw stabilization. Magic settled into patterns. Mutations became consistent enough to categorize. Early kingdoms formed as survivors organized into communities. The landscape stopped changing quite so dramatically, settling into configuration that would persist for centuries. This was when the major geographical features, the massive mountain range, the main ocean, the forest that would become home to Finn and Jake, solidified into permanence. Years 200 to 500 were the kingdom-building era. Princess Bubblegum created the Candy Kingdom properly. The Fire Kingdom established itself. The Ice Kingdom grew as Ice King's power increased. Smaller realms emerged and either thrived or collapsed based on their ability to adapt to Oo's particular challenges. This period saw the most political development, the most cultural creation, the transformation from survival groups into actual civilizations. Years 500 to 800 refined what existed. Kingdoms that survived the early period now focused on growth and optimization. Trade routes established. Diplomatic relations formed, broke, reformed. The Council of Royals began meeting irregularly to discuss issues affecting multiple kingdoms. Art and culture flourished as beings no longer spent all their energy on basic survival. By year 800, when Marceline was ancient and Ice King was completely gone, and Princess Bubblegum had solidified her control over the Candy Kingdom, Ooo was essentially the world Finn would encounter. Still dangerous, still weird, still full of threats and adventure opportunities, but established, functional. A world that had finished its transformation and now just maintained itself while occasionally trying to end itself through various apocalyptic threats. The physics of magical geography. The Land of Ooo operates on rules that blend physics and magic in ways that shouldn't work but do. Gravity functions normally until it doesn't. Time flows consistently except when it decides to be negotiable. Distance is fixed until magic offers shortcuts through dimensions or impossible architecture that makes space fold in on itself. Floating islands exist because magic said they could. The crystal dimension is accessible through mirrors because reflection and reality blurred until they became interchangeable. The forest of trees that's also inside a giant tree fort is possible, because nested dimensions are perfectly reasonable once you stop expecting reason. Weather happens, but not according to meteorological principles. Rain falls when drama requires it, or when the sky feels like raining. Snow appears in the Ice Kingdom year-round, regardless of temperature elsewhere. Rainicorns exist as both weather phenomenon and sentient species, because categories are suggestions in world that stopped respecting categorical boundaries. The Candy Kingdom maintains temperate climate despite being surrounded by diverse ecosystems. The Fire Kingdom stays hot without warming adjacent territories beyond reasonable heat transfer. The Ice Kingdom remains frozen without creating Ice Age conditions across Ooo. Each kingdom's climate is localized, contained by magical boundaries that prevent environmental spread the way physics would demand. This compartmentalization allows incredible diversity within small area. You can walk from candy paradise to frozen tundra, to volcanic wasteland to enchanted forest in a day's journey. The Land of Ooo is geographically compact but environmentally diverse, because magic compressed biomes that should span continents into distances. A 12-year-old boy and his stretchy dog can traverse between breakfast and dinner. The scars that remain, despite magical reshaping and centuries of adaptation. Ooo still bears scars from the Great Mushroom War. Radiation hot zones persist where the worst bombs fell. Ruins poke through landscape like bones through skin, reminders that this cheerful magical realm is built on civilization's corpse. Unexploded ordnance occasionally surfaces, requiring careful disposal by whoever's brave or stupid enough to handle pre-war weapons. The greatest scar is the missing chunk of planet. The bite taken from Earth isn't just cosmetic. It affects tides, rotation, possibly even the planet's orbit, though that's hard to verify when celestial mechanics have become flexible. The missing mass is absence that shapes everything around it. Negative space that influences positive space. Reminder that what's gone matters as much as what remains. Some areas never recovered. Dead zones where nothing grows, where magic itself seems reluctant to enter, where the silence is so complete it becomes oppressive. These zones serve as natural barriers between kingdoms and also as warnings. Go too far into the wasteland and you find places where the apocalypse is still happening, frozen in perpetual destruction that hasn't gotten the message about moving on. The Lich's amber prison in the Candy Kingdom's territory is another scar. Princess Bubblegum built around it rather than trying to move it, incorporating ultimate evil into her kingdom's foundation as both warning and strategic resource. She monitors it constantly, knowing that the Lich represents existential threat, but also that threats contained are better than threats loose. Marceline carries scars too, though hers are psychological rather than geographical. She remembers the world before, the transformation during, the centuries after. She's living connection to Earth's past, bridge between what was and what is. Her songs are scars made musical, trauma converted to art, memory preserved through melody because melody persists when everything else fades. Transformation as healing. So here's the question this section was building toward. Is the transformation from Earth to Ooo healing, or just different scars? Did magic repair the world the Mushroom War broke, or did it simply create new world on top of the broken one, covering damage without addressing it? The answer is both, which is unsatisfying but true. Ooo is healing in the sense that life returned, civilizations formed, beauty emerged from ruins. The world didn't stay broken, it transformed, adapted, became something capable of sustaining diverse life despite catastrophic damage. That's healing by any reasonable definition. But Ooo is also scar tissue. It's not Earth restored, but Earth rebuilt using whatever materials were available, which happened to be magic and mutation, and whatever humanity's fragments could salvage. The kingdoms are beautiful but built on graveyards. The landscapes are breathtaking but artificially maintained through magic rather than naturally stable. The whole realm is compensation for damage that can't be truly repaired. Princess Bubblegum represents this duality. She builds and protects and creates beauty, but she's always aware that everything could fall apart. Her paranoia isn't irrational. It's realistic assessment from someone who exists because the old world ended and knows the new world could end just as easily. She's healed from the apocalypse while also being a permanent reminder of what apocalypse costs. The same applies to Ice King. He's Simon transformed beyond recognition, which is both survival and tragedy. He persists, which is healing, but he persists as something that lost what made him himself, which is just different scar. The crown saved him and destroyed him simultaneously, and now he's both healed and wounded in ways that can't be separated. Finn grows up in this transformed world without knowing what was lost, which is blessing and curse. He doesn't carry direct trauma from the Mushroom War, which frees him to adventure without that weight. But he also can't appreciate what it cost to create the world he loves. His innocence is both healing, proof that new generations can start fresh, and concerning because forgetting means risking repetition. The Land of Ooo isn't Earth healed. It's Earth transformed into something that can function despite its wounds, that builds beauty on top of tragedy, that insists on living even when living requires becoming something else entirely. That's not healing in the sense of restoration to original state. That's adaptation elevated to philosophy. The world didn't recover. It became something new that doesn't need recovery because it's built for the damage it carries. And maybe that's the best kind of healing available after apocalypse. Not restoration, but transformation. Not forgetting, but incorporating. Not erasing scars, but making them part of the landscape. Visible and acknowledged, but not defining everything. The mushroom clouds bloomed, the world ended, and what grew in the aftermath was strange and beautiful and deeply weird. Exactly what you'd expect when magic gets to rebuild reality according to its own aesthetic preferences. The Land of Ooo is what happens when the universe decides that since everything's broken anyway, might as well make it interesting. Time is supposed to heal all wounds, which is technically true if you define healing as wounds stop bleeding and turn into scars that hurt less frequently, but never quite stop hurting. The 1,000 years between the Great Mushroom War and Finn waking up in a tree fort with his best friend Jake represent healing in exactly this sense. The world stopped actively dying and started figuring out how to live with the damage, but 1,000 years is a long time. Long enough for history to become legend, legend to become myth, and myth to become that weird thing. The old books mention that probably isn't real, but also explains why we have candy people, so maybe it happened. The collective memory degraded not through malice, but through the natural process of information decay when you don't have functioning educational systems, and most of your population emerge from magical mutation rather than traditional birth. The early centuries were the hardest. Survivors were too busy surviving to document what was happening, and the ones who did document quickly discovered that writing materials and preservation techniques work differently when magic has infiltrated everything. Paper would spontaneously combust or turn to candy, or decide it identified as a bird and fly away. Digital storage was pointless when electronics were all fried by EMPs. Oral tradition worked until people mutated enough that their vocal cords changed, and suddenly grandma's stories about the old world were being told in frequencies that hurt to hear. So history got lost. Not all of it. Fragments survived, carefully preserved by obsessive individuals or lucky accidents, or magic deciding that particular information deserved conservation. But most of it just evaporated like water in the post-apocalyptic sun, leaving behind residue that suggested something important used to be there, but not enough detail to reconstruct what it was. The first century, chaos management. The first 100 years post-war were essentially extended disaster response. Communities formed around whoever seemed capable of leadership, which in practice meant whoever had useful mutations or retained enough pre-war knowledge to apply it to post-war circumstances. This created extremely varied governance structures because useful was subjectively determined, and leadership was whatever you could convince people to follow. Some early leaders were genuinely qualified: scientists, military personnel, government officials who'd survived and maintained some organisational capacity. These communities tended towards structure, attempting to preserve pre-war civilization's best aspects while adapting to the new reality. They established ration systems, patrol schedules, educational programs that taught children how to read, while also teaching them which mushrooms would kill you, versus which would just make you wish you were dead. Other leaders were charismatic weirdos whose main qualification was confidence during uncertainty. These communities were more experimental, trying radical new approaches to governance because the old approaches had demonstrably failed by allowing nuclear apocalypse, democracy by collective hallucination, monarchy determined by whoever could juggle the most radioactive debris, meritocracy based on who made the best post-apocalyptic stew. If it worked, and if it didn't, well, everyone died, and the community dissolved, and some other group would try something else. A few leaders were just powerful. Magic users who'd gained abilities from the reality breaking, mutants whose transformations gave them advantages over baseline survivors, beings from other dimensions who saw opportunity in Earth's weakness. These communities were dictatorships by default, maintained through force or fear, or the understanding that arguing with someone who could freeze you solid or set you on fire was poor survival strategy. The Ice King's early kingdom fell into this category, though calling it a kingdom was generous during that period. It was more like area where Simon occasionally remembered he was supposed to be protecting people, and sometimes succeeded before the crown distracted him with thoughts about princesses who didn't exist yet. The residents tolerated him because his ice magic provided shelter and defense, even if his increasing madness made him unreliable for anything requiring sustained attention or logical thought. Marceline existed outside these power structures, too powerful to need community protection, but too connected to humanity to completely withdraw. She moved between settlements, helping where she could, leaving when Simon's deterioration became too painful to witness, returning when loneliness exceeded grief because immortality is lonely, even when you're surrounded by people who die, and get replaced by new people who also die. By century's end, maybe 200 organised communities existed across what would become Ooo, ranging from a dozen survivors huddled around a working water purifier to several thousand people building something that resembled functioning towns. The total population was perhaps 50,000, down from 8 billion pre-war, which represented survival rate that would make any apocalypse proud of its thoroughness. The 2nd and 3rd centuries. Kingdom formation. Centuries 2 and 3 saw the emergence of actual kingdoms from successful communities. The pattern was consistent. A settlement that survived long enough developed culture. Culture required preservation. Preservation needed organisation. Organisation crystallised into governance structures that resembled kingdoms, because humans default to hierarchical systems when stressed, and nothing stresses quite like post-apocalyptic reconstruction. The Candy Kingdom's formation followed this pattern almost perfectly. Princess Bubblegum emerged around year 800 pre-Finn, or 200 post-war depending on which calendar you're using, and Ooo never agreed on calendars because coordinating time zones requires caring about consistency. She organised scattered candy people into coherent society, establishing the Candy Castle as both literal and symbolic centre of what would become the most powerful kingdom in Ooo. Her approach was scientific and systematic. She researched candy people's needs, discovering they required minimal resources but maximum security, because predators found them delicious. She designed the kingdom's layout strategically, with walls that could defend against invasion and internal organisation that maximised efficiency. She created more candy people deliberately, using science that blurred into magic until the distinction was irrelevant, building her population from sugar compounds and sheer determination to protect them. But she also made it beautiful. The Candy Kingdom wasn't just functional, it was aesthetic achievement, demonstrating that survival didn't preclude artistry. The architecture referenced pre-war styles filtered through candy-coloured lens. The culture she fostered valued creativity alongside security. The kingdom became proof that post-apocalyptic civilization could be more than grim endurance, that you could build something lovely on ruins and have it mean something beyond just, we didn't die. The Fire Kingdom formed differently, through consolidation of fire people who'd scattered across after their initial mutations. They gathered at the volcano because it was logical habitat, but kingdom formation required political organisation they initially lacked. Various fire people claimed leadership. Disputes escalated into actual firefights, which for fire people meant physical combat where both parties were burning actively, and eventually the strongest emerged as Fire King. His rule was autocratic but functional. Fire people respected strength, and he was unquestionably strong. He established laws that made sense for beings made of combustion. Don't burn down the residential district. Keep your flames controlled in public spaces. Challenges for throne must be announced in advance so everyone can watch. The Fire Kingdom became simultaneously more volatile and more stable than Candy Kingdom. Culturally chaotic but politically straightforward, because when succession is determined by ritual combat, everyone knows where they stand. Lesser kingdoms emerged similarly. The Wildberry Kingdom, the Breakfast Kingdom, various food-based principalities, all formed around population centres that achieved critical mass and needed organisation. Each developed unique cultures based on their population's nature. Wildberry Kingdom was anarchic but friendly. Breakfast Kingdom was scheduled precisely because breakfast has inherent timing. The Lumpy Space Kingdom existed in dimensional bubble, because lumpy space people were too weird for standard spatial dimensions, and everyone including them agreed they needed separate reality. The 4th to 6th centuries, forgetting and myth-making. By century 4, living memory of the pre-war world was essentially gone. The last humans who remembered Earth before the bombs were either dead or so mutated, they weren't really human anymore. The ones who tried to preserve knowledge, the archivists, the historians, the obsessive documenters, had mostly failed because preserving information requires stable media and training successors and believing that future generations will care about the past. This is when history became mythology. The Great Mushroom War was still known about, still referenced, but details got fuzzy. Some kingdoms taught it as cautionary tale about the dangers of weapons without wisdom. Others treated it as origin story, the necessary destruction that allowed current civilization to emerge. A few dismissed it entirely as mythological explanation for why the world looked weird and had candy people. The Enchiridion, that ancient book of heroism, gained legendary status during this period. Originally just pre-war mystical text about magical principles, it became the Book of Heroes, capital everything, supposedly containing all knowledge about righteous behaviour and cosmic structure. Various kingdoms claimed to possess the true copy. Adventurers sought it like Holy Grail. Its actual contents, which were interesting but not world-shaking, became less important than its symbolic value as connection to before time's wisdom. Simon's video messages to Betty, preserved in his ice castle, remained unwatched because Ice King didn't remember they existed and nobody else had access to his private chambers. The historical gold mine sat in frozen storage, documentation of the apocalypse's immediate aftermath recorded by someone living through it, and it would stay hidden until Finn and Jake accidentally stumbled upon it during a princess rescue gone wrong. Princess Bubblegum tried to preserve accurate history through scientific method and careful record-keeping. She maintained archives, documented discoveries, researched pre-war sites systematically. But even she struggled with incomplete information and the challenge of separating fact from legend when dealing with the war's aftermath. Her research confirmed the war happened, documented some details about the bombs and mutations, but vast portions of the story remained gaps she couldn't fill despite centuries of effort. Marceline carried memories nobody else had. She was there, she survived, she watched it happen. But her memories were complicated by trauma and time, and the fact that she was a child when it started. She remembered her mother dying, Simon degrading, the world burning. But specific dates, casualty numbers, political factors that caused the war, those details had been beyond a frightened child's understanding and beyond an immortal vampire's concern during survival-focused centuries. So the Great Mushroom War became legendary rather than historical. The event everyone knew happened, but nobody quite understood. The explanation for Oo's existence that made sense conceptually, but was vague on practical details. The thing that happened 996 years ago, or maybe 1,000 years, or possibly longer because whose counting and also calendars are hard when you're made of candy. The emergence of cosmic players. As kingdoms established themselves and populations stabilized, larger forces took notice of Ooo. Cosmic entities who'd ignored Earth during its death throes became interested in what emerged from the ruins. The multiverse had a new player, small but magically saturated, full of potential for both creation and destruction. Prismo, existing outside time in the Time Room, watched Oo's timeline crystallize into something coherent. He'd seen countless realities, but Ooo was special. Reality-breaking event had created a nexus point where timelines branched more than usual. The Land of Ooo existed in configuration that made wish magic particularly potent, which interested Prismo professionally since wishes were his whole deal. The cosmic owl, whose dreams predicted true events, began appearing in Ooo residents' dreams with increasing frequency. The concentrated magic made prophecy easier, destiny more legible. The owl didn't intervene directly. Prophetic entities rarely do because that defeats the purpose of prophecy. But his presence meant Oo's future was being written in cosmic registers, important enough to warrant divine attention. Death found himself managing increased afterlife traffic from Ooo. The dead worlds that formed from Earth's missing chunks became populated by Oo's deceased, creating demographic challenges for cosmic bureaucracy. Death adapted, as death does, establishing specialized afterlife sections for different species, because Candy People's heaven should probably not be the same as Fire People's heaven, on account of combustion and sugar having incompatible afterlife requirements. Hunson Abadir, Marceline's father, visited more frequently. The Nightosphere's connection to Ooo remained strong from the reality breaking, making dimensional travel easier. He'd show up periodically to be spectacularly terrible at fatherhood, criticizing Marceline's life choices, eating her fries, embarrassing her in front of friends, before returning to his chaos dimension, where he presumably did whatever chaotic evil lords do between disappointing their daughters, and Golb, the embodiment of chaos and dissolution, took notice. Golb didn't act during this period. Golb rarely acts directly because chaos doesn't need to act when entropy handles most of the work. But Golb's presence became felt in Ooo, in the background chaos that resisted order, in the way things fell apart despite best efforts to maintain them. Golb was patient, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone that all their kingdom building and civilization creating was temporary arrangement before ultimate chaos reclaimed everything. These cosmic players didn't control Ooo but influenced it, their attention shaping possibilities and limiting certain outcomes. The Land of Ooo existed in Multiverse's spotlight, watched by beings who operated on scales where mortal kingdoms were interesting, but ultimately expendable experiments. The 7th to 9th centuries. Refinement and conflict. By Century 7, Oo's major kingdoms were established facts, which meant politics could evolve beyond basic survival toward actual complexity. Kingdoms had borders, trade agreements, diplomatic relations, and all the complicated nonsense that comes with organized societies sharing limited space. Wars happened. Not the reality-ending war that created Ooo, but regular territorial disputes and resource conflicts and ideological disagreements that escalated into violence, because escalation is what disagreements do when both parties have armies. The Candy Kingdom fought the Fire Kingdom over border territories. The Wildberry Kingdom had succession crisis that spilled into neighbouring realms. The Ice Kingdom declared war on everyone periodically when Ice King kidnapped princesses, and defending kingdoms objected to their royalty being imprisoned in ice dungeons. These conflicts were simultaneously serious and absurd. Serious because people died, territories changed hands, kingdoms rose and fell. Absurd because the combatants included sentient candy people, fighting living flames, stretchy dogs wielding magic swords, wizards whose primary attack was making things penguin-shaped. The war narratives that formed during this period sounded like fever dreams, and historians documenting them struggled to maintain scholarly tone when describing battles where crucial tactical advantage involved making the enemy army more flammable through strategic application of butter magic. Princess Bubblegum became masterful at politics and war simultaneously. She defended her kingdom through military strength, maintained diplomatic relations through carefully managed treaties, and manipulated situations through intelligence networks that would make pre-war spy agencies jealous. She was brilliant and ruthless in equal measure, willing to do whatever protected her people, while publicly maintaining the friendly princess persona that kept other kingdoms underestimating her. The Fire Kingdom cycled through leaders regularly because their combat-based succession meant anyone strong enough could challenge for the throne. This created instability, but also prevented any single ruler from becoming entrenched tyrant. When Flame Princess eventually took power, she'd inherit kingdom with recent history of violent transitions, which shaped her approach to rule and her eventual efforts to break the cycle. The Ice Kingdom remained weird outlier, simultaneously threatening and harmless, capable of real damage but usually just annoying, ruled by mad wizard whose schemes were dangerous, but also consistently foiled by whoever was available to stop him. Ice King's kingdom was Paradox, powerful entity everyone took seriously, but also joke everyone laughed at, threat requiring constant monitoring, but also pathetic figure deserving pity. The systematization of magic transitioned from chaotic reality-breaking force to structured system during this middle period. The first generations dealt with wild magic that did unpredictable things. Their descendants inherited magic that had settled into patterns, developed rules, became something you could study and learn rather than just surviving while reality mutated around you. Wizard schools appeared, teaching magical principles to beings with aptitude. Wizards developed specializations: ice magic, fire magic, transformation, divination, necromancy for those whose aesthetic was dark and creepy. The wizard battle became an annual event where practitioners demonstrated skills and competed for prizes, turning magical combat into sport and incidentally providing entertainment for kingdoms who enjoyed watching wizards blast each other with increasingly creative spell combinations. Magic items proliferated. The crown that cursed Simon was just one of many artifacts with reality-bending powers. The Enchiridion, obviously. Hambo, Marceline's teddy bear that became conduit for significant magic. Finn's sword that changed forms based on his relationship with violence. Jake's powers, inherited from parent who rolled around in magic puddle. Princess Bubblegum's amulet of ultimate protection. The list grew as adventurers found pre-war artifacts that magic had contaminated and post-war creations that magic had empowered. The distinction between science and magic blurred to irrelevance. Princess Bubblegum's candy creation was science, except it required magic to work. Jake's stretching was magic, except it operated by biological mechanisms. Healing spells used mystical energy to trigger physical processes that resembled medical intervention. Technology incorporated magical components because they worked, and at certain point questioning why things work becomes less important than accepting that they do. This systematization made magic teachable, which democratized power to some extent. You didn't need to be chosen by cosmic forces. You could learn magic the same way you'd learn any skill, through study and practice, and occasionally getting transformed into bugs by accidents during training. Magic literacy became marker of education, and kingdoms that promoted magical learning prospered relative to those that didn't. But systematic magic remained dangerous. You could study it, understand it, use it safely 99 times. The 100th time, it reminded you that magic is fundamentally reality doing things reality shouldn't do, and sometimes the consequences were catastrophic. Wizard Ward's experiments with dark magic created demons that plagued Ooo for generations. Ice King's use of the crown to protect people resulted in his complete identity dissolution. Power came with risks that systematization could minimize but never eliminate. The cultural amnesia problem. Here's where the long-term consequences get philosophically interesting. Oo's inhabitants lost their history, but gained culture that couldn't exist without that history. The paradox of cultural amnesia is that forgetting the past doesn't erase its influence. It just makes the influence invisible. operating as unexamined assumptions about how the world works. Candy people feared destruction without remembering the Great Mushroom War specifically. They just knew that safety required vigilance, that kingdoms needed defending, that Princess Bubblegum's sometimes authoritarian security measures were justified by threats that felt real, despite nobody quite articulating what those threats were or why they terrified so thoroughly. Fire people valued strength without connecting that value to post-war period when strength determined survival. They just knew that power mattered, that weakness invited exploitation, that their kingdom's combat-based succession made sense in ways they couldn't explain beyond, "It's how we've always done it." Ice King kidnapped princesses without remembering that behaviour originated from Simon's love for Betty, translated through crown madness into obsession with female royalty. He just knew that princesses belonged in his castle, that keeping them would fill the loneliness he felt without understanding what that loneliness represented or who he was lonely for. Marceline carried historical knowledge nobody else had but couldn't share it effectively because her memories were personal rather than historical. She remembered her mother, Simon, the early post-war chaos, but explaining that to Finn, a child who'd never experienced anything except established Ooo, required translating lived trauma into educational content, and Marceline was survivor, not teacher. Her knowledge stayed trapped in songs and occasional bitter references that confused her friends more than enlightened them. Princess Bubblegum understood this problem and tried to solve it through documentation and education. She taught candy people their history, maintained archives, conducted archaeological research on pre-war ruins. But teaching history to beings who emerged from magical mutation 2 centuries after the events in question meant the lessons felt abstract. The Great Mushroom War was important, sure, but also distant, relevant to their existence but not to their daily lives in ways they could feel viscerally. The cultural amnesia meant repeated patterns without understanding them. Kingdoms warred over resources and territory, replicating conflicts that caused the original apocalypse but in miniature, and with candy people instead of nuclear powers. Political leaders accumulated control and surveillance capability to protect their people, not realizing they were reconstructing the authoritarian tendencies that pre-war humanity had struggled with. Heroes fought villains without questioning whether hero-villain dynamics were a healthy framework for resolving conflicts, or just perpetuating a cycle of violence. The amnesia also meant Ooo couldn't learn from Earth's mistakes, because they didn't remember the mistakes clearly enough to recognize when they were making them again. The 9th century and Finn's arrival. By Century 9, approximately 900 years post-war, and 100 years before Finn's adventures, Ooo had achieved something like stable equilibrium. The kingdoms were established. Magic was systematized. Heroes and villains operated according to recognizable patterns. The world was still dangerous, but predictably dangerous, threatening in ways that could be managed through established response protocols. This was the Ooo that Marceline knew best, old enough to have history, but young enough to still feel vital, dangerous enough to stay interesting, but stable enough to build lasting relationships. She'd established herself as Vampire Queen, ruling nocturnal realm without particular political ambition, but maintaining power that made other kingdoms respectful. She'd accumulated enough trauma to fill several normal lifetimes, but also enough coping mechanisms to function despite it. Princess Bubblegum had perfected her kingdom, creating candy person society that was simultaneously utopian and dystopian, depending on whether you valued security over freedom. She ruled with absolute control, justified by absolute dedication to her people's safety. The candy people loved her and feared disappointing her in equal measure, which was probably healthy or possibly concerning, but definitely effective as governance strategy. Ice King had been completely mad for centuries, cycling through princess kidnapping schemes with variations that suggested creativity despite insanity. He'd become fixture of dangerous enough to require monitoring but consistent enough that kingdoms developed standard responses to his activities. When Ice King kidnapped your princess, you sent heroes to retrieve her. The heroes fought Ice King, the princess escaped during the chaos, and everybody returned to normal until next time. The Fire Kingdom had new ruler, Flame Princess, daughter of previous Fire King, reformer who wanted to move beyond violent succession patterns and establish diplomatic relations with other kingdoms. Her efforts were complicated by Fire Kingdom's isolationist history, and also by her nature as living flame that made diplomatic handshakes literally dangerous. And then Finn appeared. Last human child, adopted by Jake's parents, raised by stretchy dog brother to be hero. He represented fresh perspective, someone who grew up in established Ooo without carrying historical baggage. He saw the Land of Ooo as adventure opportunity rather than post-apocalyptic trauma recovery site. His innocence was both asset and limitation. It let him act without debilitating awareness of past failures, but also meant he kept accidentally replicating those failures through enthusiastic heroism. Finn's arrival marked beginning of new era for Ooo. Not because he fundamentally changed the world. He was 13 years old, limited power despite heroic ambitions, but because his perspective reframed everything. He asked questions that exposed contradictions. He challenged established patterns through simple expedient of not knowing patterns were established. He befriended people across kingdom boundaries because he didn't understand that boundaries were supposed to limit friendship. He made Ooo reassess itself through fresh eyes, which is greatest gift any culture can receive. Outside perspective that forces internal examination. 1,000 years and counting, so here's what 1,000 years of consequences looks like. A world that survived apocalypse and built something new from the ruins, that lost its history but maintained its culture, that repeated old patterns while insisting it was doing something different. Ooo, in Finn's time, was simultaneously post-apocalyptic wasteland and thriving magical realm, scar tissue and healing flesh, monument to what was lost and proof that loss doesn't prevent future. The Great Mushroom War's consequences weren't limited to immediate destruction. They echoed through centuries, shaping kingdoms and cultures and individual choices in ways that were invisible to those making them, but obvious to anyone with sufficient historical perspective. Marceline saw it. Princess Bubblegum understood it intellectually. Ice King lived it without comprehension. And Finn stumbled through it with determined cheerfulness, occasionally tripping over consequences he didn't know existed. The world ending led to world beginning, which led to world continuing, which led to world forgetting how it began while maintaining scars from the ending. That's the 1,000-year consequence. Not that the war happened, but that it keeps happening in diminished echoes, in trauma that persists past memory, in patterns that repeat because nobody remembers why they started or that stopping them is option. But also, candy people have kingdom, fire people have culture, ice wizard has castle full of penguins. Vampire queen has bass guitar and songs about her feelings. Stretchy dog and human boy have tree fort and endless adventures ahead. Life continues despite ending, which is either tragedy or triumph depending on whether you focus on what was lost or what emerged. The apocalypse happened 996 years ago, and everyone's still dealing with it, and nobody quite remembers dealing with it. And that's pretty much how long-term consequences work when you're talking timescales measured in centuries rather than years. Time healed the wounds by turning them into scars, and scars into landscape, and landscape into just how things are. And if you squint at O from the right angle, you can almost forget it was ever anything else. Almost. The universe operates on patterns, which is either reassuring evidence of cosmic order or terrifying proof that nothing truly matters, because it's all just variations on predetermined themes. The Catalyst comet cycle is one of these patterns, a 1,000-year loop where comets arrive, crash into Earth, and fundamentally alter whatever's happening at the time, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, usually for both simultaneously because the universe enjoys ambiguity. Here's the disturbing part. The Great Mushroom War wasn't special. It felt apocalyptic and unique and world-ending because, to be fair, it was all those things. But it was also just the latest iteration in a cycle that's been running since before humanity existed, that will continue after everything currently alive is dust, that treats civilizations like disposable test subjects in some cosmic experiment nobody approved and nobody can opt out of. Every 1,000 years, a Catalyst comet arrives. The comet brings an agent, a being or force that embodies some fundamental aspect of reality. Creation, destruction, change, stasis, chaos, order. Pick your cosmic force, and eventually a comet will deliver its personification directly to Earth's doorstep, like the world's worst delivery service. The green comet brought the Lich, agent of extinction. The blue comet brought Finn, agent of change and heroism. The purple comet was Orgalorg, agent of chaos masquerading as cosmic evil. And before them, stretching back through geological time, other comets brought other agents that shaped Earth's history in ways that seemed random, but followed pattern once you had sufficient perspective to recognize patterns. The dinosaurs didn't go extinct from random asteroid impact. That's what pre-war science believed, because pre-war science lacked access to cosmic records and also didn't know that magic was real. The extinction event was Catalyst Comet, bringing agent of transformation that decided dinosaurs had their turn and mammals deserved opportunity. 65 million years of evolution erased in geological instant because the comet cycle said time was up. The pattern continues. Every major extinction event, every fundamental shift in Earth's development, every moment when reality seemed to reset itself, Catalyst Comet. The cycle is mechanism by which the universe prevents stagnation, forces change, ensures that nothing lasts forever no matter how stable it appears, which raises uncomfortable questions about free will, destiny, and whether anything anyone does matters if cosmic mechanisms override individual choice every 1,000 years. The comet as cosmic reset button. Think of the Catalyst Comet cycle like the universe's version of turning it off and on again when something stops working properly. Earth develops civilization, civilization gets established, patterns calcify, and then, boom, comet arrives and forces everything to adapt or die. It's cosmic IT support, except instead of helpful technicians, you get existential threats that might destroy everything, or might create something better, or might do both, depending on variables nobody fully understands. The cycle operates independent of human concerns or desires. It doesn't care if your civilization is thriving or struggling, if you've achieved utopia or are already collapsed. When the 1,000 years are up, the comet comes, the agent arrives, reality gets renegotiated, deal with it. This explains why the Mushroom War happened when it did. Humanity was roughly 1,000 years past the previous catalyst event. The medieval period had its own comet visitation that drove various transformations in human society, though the details were lost to history even before the nuclear apocalypse finished destroying records. The cycle's timing meant Earth was due for fundamental change, and humanity's nuclear arsenal happened to provide convenient mechanism for that change to manifest catastrophically. The green comet merged with nuclear fire not by accident but by design, cosmic timing aligning with human self-destruction to create perfect storm of apocalyptic transformation. The Lich emerged because extinction was due, and the Mushroom War provided ideal circumstances for extinction to take form, but the cycle continued. The green comet brought destruction, but destruction is only half the pattern. 1,000 years later, the blue comet arrived bringing Finn, agent of heroism and change, cosmic counterbalance to the Lich's extinction imperative. Creation following destruction, hope following despair, the cycle maintaining balance by ensuring that forces cancel each other out eventually, except they don't quite cancel out. Each iteration leaves residue, changes that persist past the immediate comet's influence. The dinosaurs are still extinct despite mammals thriving. Humanity is still transformed despite Ooo flourishing. The pattern moves forward, not in circles, incorporating each cycle's changes into the next cycle's starting conditions. The universe isn't resetting Earth, it's updating Earth, installing patches that fundamentally alter the operating system while claiming to preserve user data. And the user data in this metaphor is consciousness, culture, an accumulated experience that survives transformation and informs whatever comes next. Previous incarnations and their agents. The comet cycle stretches back beyond reliable record-keeping, but fragments of information exist for those patient enough to search and powerful enough to access cosmic archives. Prismo's time room contains records of various catalyst events, available to beings who can navigate outside linear time and also don't mind their brain hurting from information overload. The purple comet, which arrived approximately 1,000 years before the green comet, roughly concurrent with medieval Earth, brought Orgolorg. This wasn't the penguin version that Ice King would eventually name Gunter, but the original form, a cosmic entity of immense power who sought to absorb the catalyst comet's energy and become universal destroyer. Orgolorg represented ambition taken to cosmic extreme, the desire for power that transcends all limits. But Orgolorg failed, He was stopped, depowered, reduced to harmless penguin form as punishment for attempting to subvert the comet cycle for personal gain. His punishment was perfectly ironic. From cosmic destroyer to adorable flightless bird, from universe-threatening entity to Ice King's pet who goes wank, and occasionally manifests eldritch horror tendencies when the plot requires it. This established important principle: you can't control the catalyst comet cycle. You can work with it, oppose it, become part of it, but attempting to dominate it results in cosmic forces putting you in your place, and your place turns out to be significantly lower on the power scale than you expected. Before Orgolorg, other comets brought other agents. A yellow comet brought transformation during Earth's early formation, when single-celled organisms were deciding whether to become complex life, or just stay comfortable as pond scum forever. The comet's agent nudged evolution toward complexity, introducing element of inevitable progression toward greater organization. A red comet arrived during the age of early mammals, bringing agent of adaptation that accelerated evolutionary processes and created the biodiversity that would eventually produce primates and subsequently humans. This comet established the pattern that later agents would follow: fundamental change that feels catastrophic during implementation, but ultimately drives progression towards something new. The cycle's ancient history suggests purpose, though whether that purpose is intentional or emergent from cosmic mechanisms operating without conscious design remains unclear. Each comet pushes Earth toward different configuration, tests different approaches to consciousness and civilization, treats the planet like laboratory, where variables get adjusted every 1,000 years to see what happens next. Earth isn't special in receiving catalyst comets. Presumably other planets have their own cycles with their own agents. But Earth is special in its response, in the way its life adapts and transforms and maintains continuity, despite repeated reality-breaking events. The cycle tries to reset Earth, and Earth keeps refusing to be fully reset, incorporating changes while maintaining core identity as planet, where consciousness insists on continuing despite everything. Finn as Blue Comet incarnation. Finn's nature as the Blue Comet's reincarnation wasn't something he knew growing up. He was just a kid who wanted adventures and helping people, and maybe kissing princesses if the opportunity arose. The cosmic significance was invisible to him, operating as background influence on his behavior without requiring conscious awareness. But Finn is the Blue Comet, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. His soul, his essential self, is the comet agent incarnated in human form. The Blue Comet brought change, heroism, the impulse to fight against darkness and protect the innocent. That's Finn distilled to essence. Hero who can't stop helping even when helping is difficult or dangerous or personally costly. This explains aspects of Finn's nature that seem almost supernatural. His unwavering optimism despite encountering horror regularly. His inability to ignore problems or walk away from people needing help. His fundamental opposition to the Lich despite being outmatched in every measurable way. These aren't just personality traits, they're cosmic programming, the comet agent's purpose expressing itself through human consciousness. The revelation of Finn's comet nature happened gradually. He encountered past incarnations through mystical means, saw glimpses of the Blue Comet's previous forms, a butterfly, a glowing being, various vessels that carried the same essential nature across thousands of years. Each incarnation different in form but identical in purpose, bring positive change, inspire others, oppose entropy and extinction. Learning this was both empowering and disturbing for Finn. Empowering because it explained why he felt compelled to hero constantly, gave cosmic justification for instincts that sometimes seemed irrational. Disturbing because it raised questions about free will. If he was literally incarnated cosmic force, were his choices his own, or was he just executing programming he couldn't override? Adventure Time's answer to this question is characteristically nuanced. Yes to both. Finn is cosmic agent, but he's also just Finn, a kid making choices based on his understanding of right and wrong. The comet influence provides foundation, but the building constructed on that foundation is his own. He's predetermined to be force for good, but not predetermined in how he expresses that goodness, what specific actions he takes, who he chooses to protect and how. The comet makes him hero. Finn decides what kind of hero to be. This distinction matters because it preserves agency while acknowledging cosmic context. Finn isn't puppet dancing on strings. He's a person with strong inclinations who chooses how to act on those inclinations. The difference between programming and preference, between cosmic inevitability and individual expression. The pattern and its implications. The Catalyst comet cycle creates uncomfortable framework for understanding Oo's history and future. If comets arrive every 1,000 years bringing fundamental change, then everything is temporary. The kingdoms will fall eventually. The species will transform again. Whatever civilization emerges in Finn's time will be unrecognizable to whatever comes after the next comet. Princess Bubblegum understands this intellectually, which contributes to her protective paranoia. She's building something beautiful and functional while knowing cosmic mechanisms ensure it won't last. Everything she creates is sandcastle at tide's edge, beautiful while it exists but ultimately doomed by forces beyond her control. This knowledge drives her to extremes. If it's all temporary anyway, might as well maximize security and order during the time available. Marceline has lived through comet cycles. She was there for the green comet's arrival, watched it merge with nuclear fire and birth the Lich. She'll probably be there for the next cycle too, assuming vampires continue their immortal existence. For her, the pattern is less abstract concept and more lived experience. She knows that stability is illusion, that change is only constant, that attachment to how things are leads to inevitable grief when cosmic forces decide how things should be instead. Ice King is oblivious to cosmic patterns because he's oblivious to most things requiring sustained attention or coherent thought. But Simon knew about the Catalyst comet cycle. His research into magical artifacts included references to cosmic mechanisms that drove historical transformations. Whether he connected that knowledge to his own situation before the crown consumed him is unclear, but it's possible he understood he was living through Catalyst event while losing his mind to cursed artifact. The Lich represents the darkest implication of the pattern. If extinction returns every 1,000 years in some form, then fighting it is delaying inevitable rather than achieving victory. The Lich can be defeated, transformed, contained, but the force he represents persists in the cosmic cycle. Eventually another extinction agent will arrive, and whoever's around when that happens will face the same struggle Finn faces against the Lich. This could be paralyzing knowledge. Why fight if the fight is eternal? Why build if building is temporary? Why care when cosmic patterns ensure that everything you love will be swept away eventually? Prismo, the time room, and cosmic infrastructure. Understanding the Catalyst comet cycle requires understanding the multiverse's structure, which means discussing Prismo the Wishmaster and the time room where he exists. Prismo lives outside linear time, at the center of the multiverse, dreaming reality into existence while managing wish requests from beings powerful enough to reach him. The time room is where you go to see how time actually works when you're not trapped in linear causality. From Prismo's perspective, past, present, and future exist simultaneously. The Catalyst comet cycle isn't a mysterious sequence of events, but visible pattern, like watching dominoes fall when you can see all the dominoes at once instead of one at a time. Prismo has seen countless iterations of the pattern, different comets, different agents, different outcomes across different timelines. In some timelines, the green comet's agent doesn't become the Lich, but something else equally destructive. In others, the blue comet's agent arrives as someone other than Finn, expressing heroism through different personality and circumstances. The pattern remains constant, but the specifics vary across multiverse's infinite branches. This multiplicity suggests the cycle isn't rigidly deterministic. The comet arrives on schedule, but what it brings and how that agent manifests depends on conditions at moment of arrival. The green comet merged with nuclear war and created ultimate extinction entity. But in timeline where humanity avoided nuclear war, the same comet might have produced different agent, still destructive, still aligned with ending, but manifesting through different mechanism. Prismo's wish magic operates within these constraints. He can grant wishes that alter personal circumstances or even change historical events, but he can't prevent the Catalyst comet cycle itself. When Finn wished the Lich never existed, Prismo couldn't actually erase the Lich from reality. He could only transform him, changing the agent's expression while maintaining the underlying cosmic pattern. This limitation isn't weakness in Prismo's power, but recognition that some things are fundamental to reality's structure. The catalyst comet cycle is weight-bearing wall in the universe's architecture. Remove it and everything collapses. Prismo can redecorate, can rearrange furniture, can even knock down some interior walls. But the foundation stays, because without it there's no structure to modify. The Cosmic Owl's prophetic dreams operate similarly. He can foresee events because the catalyst comet cycle creates predictable patterns, not predetermined outcomes, but constrained possibilities. The owl doesn't dream about random futures, but likely futures, probability distributions shaped by cosmic mechanisms. When the owl appears in someone's dream, he's signaling that their actions matter within the pattern's constraints. They can influence how the pattern expresses itself, even if they can't escape the pattern entirely. Free will versus cosmic inevitability. So here's the central question the catalyst comet cycle raises. If cosmic patterns determine major events every 1,000 years, do individual choices matter? Is Finn heroic by choice or by nature? Is the Lich evil by decision or by design? Can anyone escape roles the universe assigned them before they were conscious enough to consent to those roles? Adventure Time refuses to provide clean answer, which is appropriate for show that treats philosophical questions seriously, while also featuring characters made of candy. The pattern exists, that's confirmed, observable, documented across cosmic records. The comet cycle is real, the agents are real, the inevitability of 1,000-year transformations is real. But within that framework, choice remains. Finn is the blue comet, predetermined to be force for good. But he chooses specific applications of that goodness. He chooses to befriend rather than just protect. He chooses to grow and question rather than remaining static hero archetype. He chooses compassion over judgment, understanding over condemnation, growth over comfortable stasis. The Lich is the green comet, predetermined to pursue extinction. But even the Lich makes choices within that programming. His strategies vary, his approaches adapt. When transformed into Sweet Pea, he experiences genuine goodness despite cosmic nature aligned with destruction. The programming provides direction, but the path taken along that direction involves countless micro-decisions that accumulate into something resembling agency. Princess Bubblegum isn't comet incarnation, yet she makes choices that rival cosmic forces in their impact. She creates life, builds civilizations, influences the future through science and leadership. She's not predetermined to be anything specific, which means her choices carry different weight. Not cosmic inevitability, but human, candy human, will shaping reality through accumulated decisions. The pattern suggests that cosmic forces establish boundaries while individuals navigate within those boundaries. You can't prevent the comet from arriving, can't stop the cycle from continuing. But you can choose how to respond, how to adapt, how to maintain your values while cosmic mechanisms do their work around you. It's the difference between playing game where rules are fixed versus playing game where you can't change the board, but you can change your strategy. The catalyst comet cycle is the board, stable, predictable, unchangeable. How you play on that board remains your choice. What happens when you know the pattern? There's something uniquely cruel about understanding the catalyst comet cycle. Ignorance allows you to believe your civilization might last forever, that your achievements are permanent, that the future you're building will remain recognizably yours. Knowledge forces you to confront temporary nature of everything you love while simultaneously demanding you care enough to protect it. Marceline knows the pattern and carries that knowledge like additional weight on immortal shoulders, already bearing too much. She's watched world end and restart and evolve, and she knows it will happen again. This knowledge influences every relationship she forms. The awareness that whoever she loves will either die naturally or be swept away by next cosmic transformation creates distance even in moments of greatest intimacy. But she cares anyway. That's the remarkable part. Marceline knows everything is temporary and she loves people anyway, makes music anyway, participates in Ooze society anyway. The knowledge doesn't paralyze her into nihilistic withdrawal. Instead, it deepens her appreciation for present moments, sharpens her focus on what matters while it matters. Princess Bubblegum's response to cosmic impermanence is different. She fights it through control and organization and scientific advancement. If comets bring change, maybe sufficient preparation can manage that change, direct it toward beneficial rather than destructive outcomes. Her surveillance state, her contingency plans, her sometimes authoritarian tendencies all stem from refusal to accept that cosmic patterns should constrain her protection of candy people. Her approach is both admirable and concerning. Admirable because she refuses passivity in face of cosmic inevitability. Concerning because fighting cosmic patterns often creates problems worse than surrender would have caused. The line between preparation and paranoia is thin, and Princess Bubblegum walks it with determination that occasionally tips into territory where security becomes oppression justified by external threats. Finn doesn't know the pattern when he starts adventuring, and by the time he learns he's cosmic agent reincarnated, he's already established his heroic identity. The knowledge doesn't change his behaviour significantly because he's already being himself. The comet nature explains what he does but doesn't prescribe what he should do. This suggests that knowing the pattern is less important than being yourself within it. Fighting cosmic inevitability is pointless, but you don't have to fight the pattern. You just have to navigate it authentically, making choices that align with your values while accepting that context is provided by forces beyond your control. The next cycle. The disturbing implication of understanding the catalyst comet cycle is recognizing it continues. Finn's time in Ooo is just one iteration, a 1,000-year span that will eventually end when the next comet arrives. What happens then? What agent does it bring? What transformation does it force? The show's ending provides hints. The finale jumps forward in time to show Shermie and Beth, adventure pair living in future Ooo that looks simultaneously familiar and transformed. The kingdoms still exist in some form, but they're different. The species have evolved, the culture has shifted, time has passed, and with it change has accumulated. Whether Shermie and Beth's era is pre-comet or post-comet remains unclear. If pre-comet, they're living in calm before cosmic storm, enjoying stability before next catalyst event disrupts everything. If post-comet, they're early inhabitants of whatever comes after Finn's Ooo transforms the way Simon's Earth transformed into Finn's Ooo. Either way, the pattern continues. The cycle doesn't end because Finn defeated the Lich, or because Princess Bubblegum built Perfect Kingdom, or because Marceline survived long enough to see multiple iterations. The cycle is structural feature of reality, permanent as gravity, inevitable as entropy, fundamental as time itself. This knowledge should be depressing. In the longest view, nothing lasts. Everything you build will be transformed beyond recognition. Every achievement is temporary arrangement of matter that will be rearranged by cosmic mechanisms indifferent to your preferences. But Adventure Time treats this knowledge differently. Yes, everything is temporary, and temporary doesn't mean meaningless. Just because something doesn't last forever doesn't mean it doesn't matter while it exists. The catalyst comet cycle ensures change, but change is how things grow, how cultures develop, how consciousness expands beyond its current limitations. The cycle is feature, not bug. Maybe the catalyst comet cycle isn't punishment or threat. Maybe it's gift, the universe's way of preventing stasis, of forcing growth, of ensuring that consciousness continues evolving, instead of calcifying into permanent comfortable arrangements that resist further development. Without the cycle, Earth might still have dinosaurs, humanity might never have emerged, Oo's magical civilizations might never exist. The cycle destroys, yes, but destruction creates space for creation. The green comet brought the Lich, but it also enabled transformation that produced candy people, fire people, all the diverse species that make Ooo beautiful and strange. Finn exists because the cycle continued. He's agent of heroism incarnated specifically to oppose forces from previous cycle. The pattern doesn't just destroy, it provides counterbalance, ensures that creation follows destruction, maintains equilibrium through opposition that prevents either force from dominating completely. This perspective reframes cosmic inevitability as cosmic opportunity. The cycle guarantees change, which can be terrifying if you love things as they are, or exciting if you're curious about what comes next. Consciousness gets to participate in reality's evolution, riding catalyst comet cycle toward destinations unknown, but guaranteed to be different from current state. The question isn't whether the pattern makes us free or trapped, The question is whether we engage the pattern with creativity and courage or with resistance and fear. Marceline engages it by living fully despite knowing nothing lasts. Princess Bubblegum engages it by building beautiful things despite knowing they're temporary. Finn engages it by being heroic without worrying whether his heroism achieves permanent victory. The cycle continues. It happened before, it'll happen again. And that's either the worst news or the best news depending on whether you think change is threat or opportunity. Probably both. Like most things in Adventure Time, the answer is definitely both. The Great Mushroom War destroyed everything humanity had built over thousands of years. Cities, cultures, accumulated knowledge, the entire infrastructure of civilization reduced to radioactive rubble in a single afternoon. But here's what it couldn't destroy. The capacity for kindness when kindness serves no survival purpose, the impulse to create beauty nobody asked for, the stubborn insistence that friendship matters even when the world is ending. That's the real story of the Great Mushroom War, not the bombs or the mutations or the reality-breaking magic that transformed Earth into Ooo. Those are just mechanics. The how of what happened, the why it matters, the reason Adventure Time spends so much narrative energy exploring this apocalyptic backstory is because the war represents something fundamental about consciousness, trauma, and the human, or candy person, or fire person, or whatever, capacity to build meaning from ruins. Every episode of Adventure Time exists in the shadow of the Mushroom War. Finn's adventures happen in worlds shaped entirely by nuclear catastrophe and magical transformation. Princess Bubblegum's kingdom is built on literal ruins of pre-war civilization. Ice King's tragedy is direct consequence of choices made during apocalypse. Marceline's entire existence is defined by surviving something that killed nearly everyone else. The war is foundational text for everything that happens afterward, the original sin that created this strange paradise. But Adventure Time treats this apocalyptic foundation with characteristic tonal complexity. Yes, the war was horrific tragedy that killed billions. Also, it created a world where candy people have kingdom, and dogs can stretch, and mathematical principles determine reality. The show refuses to treat the apocalypse as purely negative event, requiring only mourning, just as it refuses to treat post-war Ooo as purely positive outcome requiring only celebration. Both things are true simultaneously, the tragedy and the beauty, the loss and the gain, the horror and the wonder. This tonal balance is the show's central achievement. Most post-apocalyptic fiction treats the end of the world as unambiguous catastrophe, where survivors struggle grimly through wasteland while mourning what was lost. Adventure Time acknowledges the catastrophe but then asks, okay, but what if what emerged from the catastrophe was interesting? What if the post-apocalyptic world was beautiful and strange and full of possibility? What if the survivors weren't just surviving, but thriving in ways that pre-war humanity never imagined? The Land of Ooo is answer to those questions. It's proof that endings enable beginnings, that destruction creates space for creation, that the worst thing that ever happened can also be origin story for something precious. Finn's inheritance. Finn inherits the Great Mushroom War's consequences without inheriting its trauma, which makes him perfect protagonist for exploring what the war means. He grew up in a world created by apocalypse, but doesn't remember the apocalypse itself. The ruins are just landscape to him. The mutations are just how things are. The absence of other humans is curiosity rather than tragedy, because he's never known anything different. This generational distance gives Finn perspective impossible for those who lived through the war. Marceline carries trauma that colours everything. She can't see the Land of Ooo without remembering what it replaced, can't form relationships without awareness of their temporary nature, can't fully embrace the present because the past won't stop haunting her. Princess Bubblegum builds frantically because she understands how easily everything can be destroyed. Ice King exists in tragedy he can't remember, but continues experiencing. But Finn just adventures. He sees dragon and fights it. He meets Princess and helps her. He encounters evil and opposes it. The simplicity of his heroism is possible, because he's not weighed down by historical context that might make heroism feel futile. He can believe in possibility of making things better, because he doesn't know how many times previous generations tried and failed and watched their achievements turn to ash. This innocence is both strength and limitation. Finn's heroism is pure, uncomplicated by cynicism or despair that often accompanies understanding of historical patterns. But his innocence also means he sometimes repeats mistakes others made, applies solutions that seem obvious to him but failed spectacularly before, charges ahead with confidence that experience would temper into caution. The war's meaning for Finn is about inherited responsibility. He didn't cause the apocalypse, wasn't alive when it happened, bears no personal guilt for humanity's self-destruction. But he lives in worlds shaped by those events and has choice about how to engage that world. He can be bitter about inheriting damaged planet, or he can treat that inheritance as opportunity to build something better. Finn chooses opportunity. That's his essential nature as Blue Comet incarnation, but also his personal choice about how to embody that cosmic role. The war created the world he lives in, and he responds by trying to make that world as good as possible, helping people, fighting evil, fostering connections across kingdom boundaries, being friend to literally everyone, including former enemies who probably don't deserve his friendship but benefit from it anyway. His approach suggests that war's legacy doesn't have to be vengeance or bitterness or perpetual mourning. It can be determination to do better, to build connections, to create meaning through actions that acknowledge past without being imprisoned by it. Finn isn't fighting to restore what was lost. He's fighting to protect what exists and help it become even better. Marceline's memory. If Finn represents moving forward, Marceline represents carrying forward. She's living bridge between Earth that was and Ooo that is memory incarnate, witness who survived long enough to tell story everyone else forgot. Her relationship to the Great Mushroom War is intimate and painful. She was there. She survived, she remembers, and remembering is burden that gets heavier the longer you carry it. Marceline watched her mother die slowly from radiation poisoning, watched Simon degrade from kind protector to mad wizard, watched world burn and transform and eventually stabilize into something unrecognizable from her childhood. She's accumulated centuries of loss, friends who died, lovers who aged while she remained young, entire civilizations that rose and fell during her immortal lifetime. The war's meaning for Marceline is about what you carry when you can't forget. She could become bitter, angry at universe that subjected her to endless loss. Some vampires in her position probably did exactly that, became monsters that treated other beings as disposable, because attachment leads to grief, and grief is unbearable when it accumulates across centuries. But Marceline chose differently. She makes music instead of making war. She forms friendships despite knowing they're temporary. She visits Ice King and plays along with his delusions instead of abandoning him to madness. She dates Princess Bubblegum despite all her experience screaming that caring for immortal candy scientist will inevitably lead to pain when philosophical differences or simple exhaustion cause relationship to fracture. Her choice is radical act of defiance against despair. The war taught her that everything ends. She learned that lesson more thoroughly than anyone should have to. But instead of concluding that ending makes things meaningless, she decided that temporary things matter more because their temporary nature makes each moment precious. When Marceline plays I Remember You for Ice King, she's performing act of love that defies practical logic. Ice King can't appreciate the gesture fully. He doesn't understand the significance, doesn't remember being Simon, doesn't grasp that this vampire queen singing goofy lyrics about playing basketball is actually memorial to relationship that shaped both their lives. But Marceline plays anyway, because remembering matters even when the person you're remembering can't remember themselves. Because maintaining connection matters even when connection is one-sided. Because the alternative, forgetting, abandoning, treating Ice King as lost cause, would mean letting the war win retroactively by allowing it to erase relationships it damaged. The war's legacy in Marceline is refusal to let trauma prevent love. She knows the cost of caring. She's paid it repeatedly across centuries, and she cares anyway, makes art anyway, participates in Ooze society anyway, remains present instead of withdrawing into protective numbness. That's heroism of different type from Finn's, not fighting dragons but fighting despair, not saving princesses but saving herself from becoming monster that trauma could easily justify. Princess Bubblegum's control. Princess Bubblegum never experienced the Great Mushroom War directly. She was created centuries after the bombs fell, emerged into a world that had already stabilized into post-apocalyptic configuration. but she understands the war intellectually with thoroughness that rivals direct experience. She's researched it, studied the ruins, analysed the mutations, reconstructed timeline with scientific precision. This intellectual understanding shapes her entire approach to leadership. Princess Bubblegum knows that civilization can end, not in abstract way, but in concrete, detailed understanding of mechanisms that cause collapse. She knows about nuclear arsenals, political tensions, escalation dynamics, technological advancement without corresponding ethical development. She knows humanity destroyed itself through a combination of capability and poor judgment, and she's determined to prevent Ooo from making similar mistakes. This determination manifests as control, surveillance networks that monitor threats, contingency plans for every possible danger, willingness to sacrifice individual freedom for collective security. Princess Bubblegum's sometimes authoritarian tendencies aren't power hunger or malice, but response to knowing how quickly everything can fall apart if leadership isn't vigilant. The war's meaning for her is about responsibility of knowledge. She can't unknow what she's learned about civilization's fragility. She can't pretend that her kingdom is safe just because it's currently thriving. The ruins underneath her castle are a constant reminder that someone built cities here before, thought they were secure and ended up erased from existence. But her response to this knowledge creates its own problems. In trying to prevent apocalypse, she sometimes implements policies that look apocalyptic from her citizens' perspective. Surveillance that feels oppressive, security measures that restrict freedom, decisions made without consultation because she believes she knows better. Her protection becomes smothering, her vigilance becomes paranoia, her knowledge becomes justification for control that maybe isn't justified after all. The show treats this ambivalently, which is appropriate. Princess Bubblegum isn't wrong about threats. Ooo faces regular existential dangers that require decisive leadership and strategic planning. But she's also not entirely right about solutions. Some problems can't be controlled into submission. Some threats require trust and collaboration rather than surveillance and contingency plans. Her arc involves learning to balance security with freedom, control with trust, knowledge with humility about knowledge's limits. The war taught her that inadequate preparation leads to catastrophe. But over-preparation creates different catastrophe, one where safety becomes prison and protection becomes oppression. The war's legacy in Princess Bubblegum is constant tension between remembering danger and trusting in resilience, between learning from past and not being trapped by it, between protecting what she loves and allowing it freedom to exist without constant oversight. Ice King's tragedy. Ice King represents the war's most personal tragedy. Individual transformed beyond recognition, identity consumed by choices made during crisis, consciousness preserved, while the person that consciousness belonged to is effectively dead. Simon Petrikov died during the Great Mushroom War, killed not by radiation or violence, but by crown he wore to protect himself and others from those threats. The war's meaning through Ice King is about cost of survival. Simon survived when billions didn't, kept himself and Marceline alive through years when death would have been easier. That's admirable, heroic even, exactly the kind of self-sacrifice that deserves recognition and gratitude. But survival cost him everything that made survival worth having. His identity, his memories, his love for Betty, his understanding of who he was and why that mattered. Ice King is functionally immortal, protected by crown magic from aging or disease or harm. He's survived nearly 1,000 years, will probably survive 1,000 more unless something catastrophic destroys him. But what survives isn't really Simon anymore. It's echo, fragment, ghost inhabiting body that used to belong to someone else. The tragedy is compounded by Ice King's obliviousness to his own tragedy. He doesn't sit around mourning Simon Petrikov because he doesn't remember being Simon Petrikov. He experiences his existence as fine, mostly. Lonely but fine, confusing but fine, full of princess-related plans that never work out, but hey, maybe next time. The suffering isn't sharp pain but dull absence, the ache of missing something you can't remember losing. When Finn and Jake discover Simon's video messages and show them to Ice King, his response is heartbreaking. Brief moment of recognition where he glimpses who he used to be, feels weight of what he's lost, understands that the person in those videos died so that he could exist. Then the moment passes, the crown reasserts control, and Ice King is back to planning his next princess kidnapping with renewed enthusiasm that might be coping mechanism or might be genuine inability to maintain coherent thought. The war's legacy in Ice King is question about whether survival justifies any cost. Simon saved lives by wearing the crown, protected Marceline through apocalyptic wasteland, gave her childhood that included songs and safety instead of just radiation and terror. That matters. That's worth something. But did it justify losing himself? Would Marceline, if given choice, have chosen for Simon to sacrifice his identity for her survival? Would Simon, if he'd known the full price up front, have still put on the crown that first time? These questions don't have clean answers, because clean answers would require knowing what would have happened in alternative timelines where different choices were made. What's clear is that Ice King's tragedy illustrates the war's personal cost in a way that statistics about billions dead cannot. Billions dead is an incomprehensible number. One person transformed beyond recognition while maintaining just enough awareness to occasionally realise what he's lost. That's tragedy. Human consciousness can process and mourn appropriately. The show's ultimate message. Adventure Time spent 10 seasons exploring post-apocalyptic world with such aggressive cheerfulness that many viewers initially missed the apocalyptic part entirely. But the cheerfulness was never denial of tragedy. It was response to tragedy, deliberate choice about how to engage world that was broken and beautiful simultaneously. The show's message about the Great Mushroom War crystallizes through accumulated episodes, character arcs, revelations about backstory that recontextualize everything that came before, and that message is surprisingly hopeful for show, built on foundation of a nuclear holocaust and civilizational collapse. Here's what Adventure Time argues. Yes, the world ended. Yes, billions died. Yes, humanity destroyed itself through a combination of stupidity, pride, and inability to resolve conflicts without violence. All of that is true and terrible and worthy of mourning, but also, look what came after. Look at the Land of Ooo with its candy kingdoms and fire kingdoms and ice kingdoms. Look at the friendships that span species boundaries. Look at the art and music and culture that emerge from ruins. Look at Finn and Jake having adventures, making mistakes, growing as people despite living in a world that should have crushed hope entirely. The apocalypse created conditions for something new and strange and beautiful to emerge. Not better than what was lost. You can't really compare pre-war Earth with its billions of humans to post-war Ooo with its thousands of candy people and fire people and all the other impossible species. They're different, and different can't be ranked as simply better or worse, but different can be valuable. Different can be worth protecting. Different can be evidence that endings enable new beginnings, that even the worst catastrophe doesn't prevent life from continuing, and consciousness from finding meaning, and beings from forming connections that make existence worthwhile. The show refuses to treat the war as a good thing that needed to happen to create Ooo, that would trivialize the suffering and death. But it also refuses to treat Ooo as permanently tainted by its apocalyptic origins, that would dismiss all the beauty and kindness and genuine good that exists in post-war world. Instead, Adventure Time holds both truths simultaneously. The war was catastrophic tragedy. Ooo is genuine achievement. Both statements are completely accurate and neither negates the other. That's the show's sophistication, its ability to treat heavy themes seriously while maintaining sense of wonder and possibility, its refusal to collapse into either grimdark despair or naive optimism. What we learn from endings. The Great Mushroom War teaches us that endings are inevitable but not final. Earth ended as humanity knew it, but Earth continued as something else. Humanity ended in its original form, but consciousness persisted through mutations and transformations. Civilization collapsed, but new civilizations emerged from the rubble. This pattern repeats at every scale. Simon ended, but Ice King began. Betty left, but her impact remained. The pre-war world vanished, but its influence shaped everything that came after. Nothing truly ends completely. It just transforms into something else. And whether you experience that transformation as death or evolution depends on your perspective and how much you're willing to accept change as a legitimate form of continuation. Adventure Time argues for accepting change, not passively, not without grieving what's lost, but ultimately accepting that transformation is how things continue rather than how things end. Marceline accepts that Simon is gone while maintaining relationship with Ice King. Princess Bubblegum accepts that candy people aren't human, while treating them as worthy inheritors of humanity's legacy. Finn accepts that he lives in post-apocalyptic world while treating it as just world, the only one he knows, the one he's committed to protecting. The show suggests that mourning and moving forward aren't opposites but complementary processes. You can grieve what was lost while celebrating what exists. You can acknowledge tragedy while refusing to let tragedy define everything. You can remember the Great Mushroom War while living fully in the Land of Ooo that emerged from it. This is relevant to viewers even if they never experience actual apocalypse. Life involves smaller endings constantly. Relationships end, careers end, versions of yourself end as you grow and change. The show's message about the Mushroom War applies to these personal endings too. Yes, endings hurt. Yes, loss is real. And also, what comes after the ending deserves your attention and care and willingness to engage it fully, rather than just wishing you could return to what was lost. The beautiful broken world. The Land of Ooo is beautiful and broken in equal measure, and that combination is what makes it work narratively and thematically. If it was just beautiful, it would be shallow fantasy escapism. If it was just broken, it would be depressing post-apocalyptic fiction that mistakes nihilism for profundity. But beautiful and broken together, that's real, that's honest. That's how worlds actually work when you look at them clearly. The candy people are beautiful creation, sentient beings made from sugar who build kingdom and culture and meaningful lives. They're also mutations created by radiation and magic transforming dying humans into something that could survive hostile environment. Both facts are true simultaneously. The beauty doesn't erase the horror of their origin, and the horror doesn't diminish the beauty of their current existence. The Ice Kingdom is beautiful. Crystalline spires that catch light in spectacular ways, architecture that demonstrates mastery of frozen art form. It's also prison for mad wizard trapped in curse he can't escape, built from Simon's degraded consciousness and maintained by magic that destroyed him. Beautiful and broken, impressive and tragic, worth preserving and worth mourning. Marceline's music is beautiful, complex compositions that blend rock and electronica, and emotions that most beings don't live long enough to accumulate. It's also product of trauma, songs about fathers who left and mothers who died and ice wizards who forgot her name. The beauty emerges from brokenness, and the brokenness is visible in the beauty, and neither can be separated from the other because they're fundamentally intertwined. This is Adventure Time's most mature insight about the Great Mushroom War. You can't fix what's broken by pretending it isn't broken, but you also can't honour what's broken by refusing to build something beautiful on top of it. The war happened, can't be undone, permanently shaped everything that came after, but dwelling exclusively on that fact means surrendering to despair that prevents engagement with present reality. The show models healthy relationship with trauma and catastrophe. Acknowledge it, understand its impact, carry it forward without letting it dominate every moment. The war is foundational but not definitional. Ooo is built on apocalypse but isn't reducible to apocalypse, contains multitudes that extend beyond its traumatic origin. Moving forward. So what does the Great Mushroom War mean for those of us watching from our pre-apocalyptic reality where nuclear weapons still exist but hopefully remain unused? What lessons transfer from fictional catastrophe to real concerns about our world's trajectory toward various potential disasters? The show's answer seems to be, don't give up on beauty just because you understand fragility. Don't refuse connection just because you know it's temporary. Don't stop building just because you recognize that everything eventually falls apart. The knowledge that endings come doesn't justify refusing to begin. Princess Bubblegum builds her kingdom despite knowing kingdoms fall. Marceline loves people despite knowing love leads to loss. Finn fights evil despite knowing good doesn't always win. Ice King builds ice kingdoms despite forgetting why he's building them. All of them continue, persist, engage with world that's damaged and dangerous and beautiful and worth protecting. The war destroyed everything, and life continued. That's the core message. Not that destruction is okay or that suffering doesn't matter, or that we should welcome apocalypse as opportunity for fresh start. But that consciousness persists, connection matters, and the capacity to create meaning from chaos is fundamental to what thinking beings do. We build sandcastles knowing the tide will wash them away. We form relationships knowing they'll end through death or distance or simply growing apart. We create art that will eventually be forgotten, build civilizations that will eventually collapse, make meanings that will eventually be unmade, and we do it anyway, because doing it anyway is what gives life texture and purpose and significance that transcends the inevitable ending. The Great Mushroom War is extreme version of ending we all face continuously. Entropy wins eventually. Everything falls apart given sufficient time. Heat death awaits at universe's conclusion regardless of how we spend the interim. But Adventure Time argues that this knowledge should intensify engagement rather than prevent it, should make present moments more precious rather than rendering them meaningless. The final question. The Great Mushroom War happened 996 years before Finn's adventures. It destroyed Earth, killed billions, transformed reality itself through combination of nuclear fire and magical contamination. And the world that emerged was strange and beautiful and deeply weird, full of candy people and fire people and ice wizards and stretchy dogs and adventures that happen daily, because when reality breaks, it breaks toward possibility as often as toward catastrophe. Was it worth it? That's the question the show circles around without quite answering directly. Was the apocalypse that created Ooo worth the price Earth paid? Would you trade billions of human lives for thousands of candy people? Would you sacrifice pre-war civilizations' accumulated knowledge for post-war civilizations' magical wonder? The question is unanswerable because it's fundamentally unfair. You can't weigh lives against each other, can't measure human civilization against candy civilization, using any metric that isn't hopelessly biased. The war wasn't choice with alternatives, it was catastrophe that happened, and asking whether the outcome justified the cost is category error that treats intentional trade when it was actually tragedy followed by adaptation. But if we reframe the question, given that the war happened and Ooo emerged from it, is Ooo worth protecting? Is the world that exists now, with all its strangeness and beauty and brokenness, worth caring about despite its apocalyptic origin? Adventure Time's answer is clear. Yes. Absolutely. Without qualification or hesitation. The Land of Ooo is worth protecting, its inhabitants are worth caring about, its culture is worth preserving. Not because it's better than what came before, but because it exists now, and existing things deserve care regardless of how they came to exist. Finn fights to protect Ooo not because he thinks apocalypse was a good idea, but because Ooo is his home, and homes are worth defending. Marceline continues despite centuries of loss, not because she's forgotten the cost, but because she remembers what Simon taught her about kindness mattering, even when everything else fails. Princess Bubblegum builds and protects and occasionally oversteps boundaries, not because she thinks candy people are superior to humans, but because they're her people, and leaders protect their people regardless of origin story. The war destroyed the world, and the world that emerged from destruction is worth everything we can give it. That's not the same as saying the war was good. That's saying life continues, consciousness persists, and what matters is what we do with the world we inherit rather than dwelling exclusively on how we inherited it. In this video, we talked about the Great Mushroom War killed almost everyone and changed everything. Simon became Ice King, losing himself to save Marceline. The Lich emerged from green fire as extinction incarnate. Humanity transformed into candy people and fire people, and all the impossible species that populate Ooo. Magic flooded through reality's cracks, rewrote natural laws, turned Earth into the Land of Ooo where adventures happen and dogs can stretch and mathematical. But underneath all that transformation, underneath the mutations and the kingdoms and the 1,000 years of accumulated change, something persisted. The capacity for kindness Simon showed Marceline. The determination Princess Bubblegum demonstrates protecting her people. The heroism Finn embodies despite never knowing world before the apocalypse. The creativity Marceline channels into music instead of rage. These things, kindness, determination, heroism, creativity, survived the end of everything. They persisted through radiation and mutation, and reality-breaking magical contamination. They transferred from humanity to candy people, from Earth to Ooo, from the old world to the new one, proving that consciousness's fundamental values don't depend on specific biological configuration or particular cultural context. The Great Mushroom War destroyed Earth but couldn't destroy what makes consciousness valuable. And maybe that's the real story worth telling. Not that the world ended, but that even ending wasn't powerful enough to prevent new beginning. That even worse catastrophe imaginable left space for beauty and friendship and adventures that make existence meaningful despite its temporary nature. The apocalypse happened, life continued. And the Land of Ooo, built on ruins and mutations and the accumulated consequences of humanity's worst day, is proof that endings and beginnings are just different names for the same transformation viewed from different angles. The sky turned green 996 years ago, and everything changed. But everything continuing, that's the real magic, more powerful than any spell or crown or cosmic comet cycle. The world ended, and then the world began again, and that's pretty mathematical when you think about it. So here's the question for you. What does the Great Mushroom War mean to you? How does knowing Adventure Time's backstory change how you see Finn and Jake's adventures? Does the apocalyptic foundation make Ooo more precious or more tragic? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is the kind of heavy lifting that requires community processing, and also because discussions about apocalypse are more fun when they involve candy people and stretchy dogs than when they're just about our actual nuclear arsenals. The war happened, we're still here, and as long as we're here we might as well make it algebraic.